Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. This also keeps you updated with new episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere. It was an old sedan, so it wasn't exactly a surprise, but it was still frustrating. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make it to the next town before dark, and I thought I could push it a bit further. Then the engine started sputtering, and before I knew it, the whole thing just died. There was nothing around me except fields, and I couldn't even see any houses. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The only thing I had going for me was a gas station I remembered seeing a few miles back. I grabbed my water bottle, locked the car, and started walking. It wasn't long before I reached the station. It was old, the kind that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. There was a single pump and a small building with a sign that just said gas. I was hoping there'd be someone inside who could help me. The door creaked when I opened it, and inside, a guy sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He was in his 50s, maybe, wearing greasy coveralls like he'd been working on cars all day. When he looked up, he smiled and asked what he could do for me. I explained my car had broken down a few miles away, and he nodded like it happened all the time. "You're in luck," he said. "I'm the mechanic here too. Let's take a look." We hopped into his truck, and he drove me back to my car. He seemed friendly enough, chatting about the weather and how quiet things were around here. When we got to the car, he popped the hood, poked around a bit, and then told me he'd need to tow it back to the station. He hooked it up to his truck, and we headed back. At first, I felt relieved that I'd found help so quickly. I figured I'd be back on the road in a couple of hours. But as we got back to the gas station, something started to feel off. He took the car around back to his garage, which was behind the station. I followed him inside, and that's when I realized how isolated this place really was. There were no other cars, no people coming and going, just us. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows around the station stretched out, making everything feel a little more sinister. He said the engine was pretty bad and that it would take a while to fix. I asked if there was somewhere nearby I could stay for the night, and he just shook his head. "Not much around here," he said. "You're better off waiting here." That's when things started to change. He wasn't as friendly as before. His tone was different, a bit colder. I tried calling a tow service or another garage, but my phone still didn't have a signal. I asked if I could use his landline, and he told me it was down. "Storm knocked it out last week," he said. I started to feel trapped, but I didn't want to cause any trouble. I sat in the small waiting area inside the station, flipping through an old magazine while he worked on my car. The hours dragged on. I looked outside, and it was pitch black. I couldn't hear anything except the occasional clanging from the garage. At one point, I went out to check on him, and he snapped at me. "I told you, it's gonna take time," he said, not looking up from the engine. His face was different now, harder, meaner. I didn't like the way he was acting, but I didn't know what to do. My car was in pieces, and I was miles from anywhere. When I went back inside, I noticed something strange. There was a phone behind the counter. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out. If the landline was down, why was it still there? I wanted to ask him about it, but something told me not to. As the hours passed, my anxiety grew. Every time I checked on the car, it seemed like he wasn't making any progress. In fact, it almost looked like he was undoing things, making the problem worse. I started to feel like he didn't want me to leave. At one point, I overheard him talking to someone on the phone in the back. It was muffled, but I caught enough to know he was lying to me. He had a working phone. He was telling someone that I was here, stuck. That's when I knew I had to get out. I waited until he went back to the garage and then quietly went behind the counter to grab the phone. I was shaking, but I managed to dial 911. It rang twice before I heard a click, and then nothing. Just silence. No operator, no sound. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. It was like someone was intercepting the call. I looked out the window and saw him standing there, staring at me through the glass. He wasn't smiling anymore. He just watched me for a few seconds, then went back into the garage. I was panicking now. I didn't know who he was talking to, but it didn't feel right. I started looking for something I could use as a weapon, just in case. The only thing I found was a rusty tire iron near the front door. I sat there, clutching the tire iron, waiting. Every noise made me jump. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the wind outside, it all felt too loud, too close. I didn't want to confront him, but I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. My only hope was that someone would come by the station and help. Hours passed, and no one came. It was well into the night when he finally came back inside. His hands were greasy, and his face was set in that same hard expression. "Car's gonna need a part one don't have," he said. "You're stuck here until I can get it." I knew he was lying. I could feel it in my gut. But I didn't say anything. I just nodded and told him I'd wait. He stared at me for a long time before walking out the door again. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness outside. That's when I made my move. I grabbed my bag and the tire iron and slipped out the back door. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I ran into the night, through the fields behind the station, praying I wouldn't hear him coming after me. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, but I kept going, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how far I'd gotten when I heard a truck engine in the distance. I crouched down in the tall grass, holding my breath. The headlights of his truck swept across the field, searching. He was looking for me. I stayed as still as I could, my body trembling. The truck passed by, and I heard it drive off into the distance, but I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I got up and started walking again, staying off the road, cutting through fields and wooded areas. I walked for what felt like hours until I finally saw lights in the distance. It was another gas station, and this one had people. I stumbled inside, barely able to speak, but I told the clerk what had happened. They called the cops, and I waited for them to arrive. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, looking for me. The police found my car back at the station, but the mechanic was gone. They told me they'd keep looking for him, but I never heard anything after that. It started off so normal, which is what makes it hard to even explain how bad things got. I wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just scrolling through my phone late at night like I always do. I was on a few dating apps, mostly just swiping, chatting, trying to meet new people. I never thought much of it. It's what everyone does these days. You talk to people, meet a few, most of them are weird or don't go anywhere. It's nothing, right? I met this guy online. His profile seemed fine, nothing too flashy or strange. He had pictures of himself hiking, at a few events, stuff like that. His bio said he was into traveling, which I liked. So I swiped, we matched, and we started chatting. It was normal at first. He seemed friendly. His name was Ryan. We talked about the usual stuff, where we were from, what we did for work. He asked a lot of questions, but nothing that seemed too weird. At the time, I figured he was just really interested. We messaged for a few weeks, on and off. I was busy with work and life, and sometimes I'd take a day or two to respond. He'd follow up with a few messages when I didn't reply right away, but again, nothing that set off alarm bells. I didn't think much of it. Then he started asking to meet up. I wasn't sure. I mean, I hadn't gotten any bad vibes, but something just didn't feel right. Maybe it was because he started getting more persistent, messaging more often, always asking where I was or what I was doing. I told him I wasn't really in the mood to meet just yet, and that's when things changed. At first, he seemed to take it okay. He stopped asking for a while, and I thought maybe he got the hint. But soon after, I started noticing weird things. Like, really weird. I'd be out at the grocery store or running errands, and I'd get a text from him saying something like, "Hey, are you at the store?" I thought it was a joke at first, but then he'd send another message right after, describing what I was wearing or where I was standing. The first time it happened, I froze. I looked around the store, trying to see if he was there. There were people everywhere, but I couldn't pick him out. I didn't even know what to do, so I didn't respond. I just grabbed my stuff and left, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, maybe he guessed, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next few days were the same. I'd go out, and he'd message me again, knowing exactly where I was. I was freaked out, but I didn't want to overreact, you know? Maybe I'd mentioned where I was going in passing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But it kept happening. Every time I left my apartment, there was a message waiting for me. The more it happened, the more I felt like I was being watched. One night, I came home late from work. I was exhausted, just wanting to shower and collapse into bed. I hadn't been checking my phone much that day because I'd been avoiding his messages. When I finally looked, there was a long string of texts. He'd been asking me where I was, why I hadn't responded. The last message was the worst one. It just said, "I'm outside." I thought I was going to be sick. I ran to the window, my hands shaking. I didn't see anyone at first, just the usual dark street. But then, after a few seconds, I saw him. He was standing on the other side of the road, just staring up at my building. I don't know how long he'd been there, but the fact that he had been there at all made my stomach drop. I didn't know what to do. I felt frozen, my phone still in my hand. I texted him back, asking what he was doing there. He responded almost immediately, saying something about how he just wanted to see me, how I'd been ignoring him. That's when I blocked him. I should have done it sooner, but it didn't occur to me until then how serious this was. But blocking him didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. The next day, I got a new message, this time from an unknown number. It was him, again. "Why'd you block me?" he asked. The thought of him getting a new number just to keep texting me made my skin crawl. I blocked that number, too, but the messages kept coming. He always found a way around it. He started sending pictures. Not of him, but of me. Pictures of me walking down the street, going to work, standing in line at the coffee shop. He was everywhere, watching me all the time, and I had no idea. He knew where I lived, where I worked, and what I did every day. I stopped going out. I started calling in sick to work. I even considered moving, but I didn't have the money for that. I couldn't even think straight. I felt trapped in my own apartment, terrified to leave, but also scared to stay. Every noise outside made me jump. I was constantly checking the windows, the locks. I couldn't sleep. One night, things escalated. I was lying in bed, trying to calm down, when I heard a noise outside my window. I live on the second floor, so at first, I thought it couldn't be anything. But then I heard it again. A scraping sound, like something or someone was trying to get in. I got up, my heart racing, and went to the window. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw him. He was right there, standing on the fire escape, trying to pry the window open. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes locked on me. I screamed and backed away, grabbing my phone to call the police. I don't even remember what I said when they answered, just that I needed help, that someone was trying to break in. I kept looking at the window, expecting him to smash it and come inside. But he didn't. When he saw me on the phone, he just stood there for a moment, staring at me. Then he backed away and disappeared down the fire escape. The police arrived a little while later. I told them everything, but there wasn't much they could do. They couldn't find him. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. I filed a report, but that was it. I was on my own. After that, the messages stopped for a while. I thought maybe he'd finally given up, or that the police showing up had scared him off. I tried to go back to my normal life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. A few weeks later, I got another message. It was from an unknown number again, but this time it was a picture. A picture of my apartment building, taken from across the street. Underneath it, he'd written, "I'm still here." When my great-uncle passed away, I didn't expect anything to come from it. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and he was the kind of relative no one really knew much about. So, it was a surprise when I got a letter from a lawyer saying he'd left me his house and his will. The house was old, out in the middle of nowhere. I didn't even know it existed before I got the letter. I wasn't planning to keep it, just sell it, maybe fix it up a little first to make it more appealing. At the time, I thought it was a lucky break. I went to check it out one weekend. The house was exactly what you'd expect for something that hadn't been lived in for years. Run-down, creaky floors, windows covered in grime. It looked like no one had touched it in decades. I wasn't too worried about it. I figured it would take a little work, but I'd be able to get it in shape to sell. The first few days there were uneventful. I stayed in a local motel because the house wasn't in any condition to sleep in, but I spent my days cleaning and clearing out old furniture. The place was a mess, but nothing I couldn't handle. There were a few strange things I noticed, though things that didn't quite add up. For one, there was a strange smell in the house, especially near the basement. At first, I thought it was just mold or something from years of neglect. But it didn't smell like mold. It smelled stale, like something had been left to rot. I tried to ignore it, but it lingered, especially near the door leading to the basement stairs. Then, there were noises. Nothing too obvious, but little sounds, like something shifting in the walls or the floor creaking when it wasn't moving. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe an animal that had gotten in. Still, it made me uneasy, especially when I was alone in a quiet room. You don't realize how loud silence can be until you're in an old house like that, and every little noise feels amplified. The basement itself was locked up tight. The door had a heavy padlock on it, and I couldn't find a key anywhere in the house. That was another thing that didn't sit right with me. Why would someone lock up their own basement and not leave a way to get in? But I figured it wasn't important. I could deal with it later when I had the right tools to break the lock. A few days in, things started to get strange. I was working in one of the upstairs bedrooms, scrubbing the walls and clearing out cobwebs, when I heard something downstairs. It was a faint sound at first, like a footstep, but then it grew louder. I stopped what I was doing and listened. It sounded like someone was walking around on the first floor, slowly, like they were trying to be quiet. I called out, thinking maybe someone had wandered in, but there was no answer. I went downstairs to check it out, but when I got there, no one was around. The front door was still locked, and all the windows were shut. I walked through each room, calling out again, but it was dead silent. My heart was racing by that point, but I couldn't find any explanation for the noise. Later that night, when I was about to leave for the motel, I saw something that stopped me cold. As I was locking up the front door, I glanced over at the window that faced the backyard. In the reflection, I saw a figure standing behind me, just a glimpse, but enough to know it wasn't my imagination. I spun around, but there was no one there. The house was empty. Or at least, it was supposed to be. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided I needed to get into the basement. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, something I needed to see. I went into town, bought a bolt cutter, and came back to break the lock. The moment I cut through the padlock and opened the door, the smell hit me full force. That stale, rotten smell. It was so strong I had to cover my nose as I made my way down the stairs. The basement was pitch black, and the light switch didn't work. I had to use my phone's flashlight to see. The basement was empty at first glance. Just old boxes and some rusted tools. But then, in the far corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a mattress on the floor, dirty and stained, like it had been there for a long time. Next to it were piles of clothes, food wrappers, and empty cans. Someone had been living down there. Before I could process what I was looking at, I heard a sound behind me, a soft creak, like someone stepping on the stairs. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room, but I didn't see anyone. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I swung the flashlight back toward the stairs, and that's when I saw them. A figure, standing at the top of the stairs, just watching me. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I knew they'd been living in my house. In the basement. Panic hit me hard. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, blocking my only way out. Then, slowly, they started to come down the stairs, one step at a time. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I couldn't breathe. The closer they got, the more I could make out their features. It was a man, gaunt, with sunken eyes and filthy clothes. He looked like he hadn't seen daylight in years. I don't know what came over me, but I bolted. I ran past him, up the stairs, shoving him out of the way. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I just got in my car and drove, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I went to the police, told them everything. They came out to the house, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the basement, found the mattress, the clothes, the food wrappers, everything I'd seen. But they didn't find him. That night, I stayed at a friend's place. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the house. I thought maybe it was over, that he'd left for good. But the next morning, I got a call from the police. They'd gone back to the house to do another search and found something I hadn't seen. There was a hidden door in the basement, behind one of the old shelves. It led to a small crawl space, barely big enough to stand in. Inside, they found signs that more than one person had been living there. There were makeshift beds, more food wrappers, and even a few personal items, photos, journals, things that belonged to other people. The police said they'd keep looking for whoever had been living there, but I knew they wouldn't find them. They were long gone, probably watching from the woods, waiting for their next chance to come back. I sold the house as soon as I could. I didn't care about fixing it up anymore. I just wanted to be rid of it, to get as far away from that place as possible. I've been a long-haul truck driver for almost 5 years now. It's a tough job, but I like the freedom of the road. You get used to being alone, and most of the time, that's fine with me. You stop at truck stops, grab food, maybe chat with another driver if they seem friendly, then get back on the road. You learn to keep to yourself, especially at the more rundown places. This happened a few months ago, late one night, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I'd been driving for hours, making my way across a stretch of highway that didn't have much of anything, just fields, occasional gas stations, and a whole lot of darkness. It was around 2 a.m., and I was starting to get tired, so I figured I'd pull over at the next truck stop to rest for a bit, maybe grab a cup of coffee. I saw the sign for a stop a few miles up and took the exit. It was one of those small, isolated places, just a single gas station with a few pumps, a convenience store, and a couple of trucks parked out back. The kind of place you don't expect to see anyone unless they're on the road too. I pulled my rig into the lot and parked near the back, away from the few cars that were parked near the entrance. As I stepped out of the cab, I noticed something odd right away. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally, even in the middle of the night, there's some kind of noise. Maybe a truck idling, or someone talking, but here, there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind and my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the store. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured it was late, and everyone was probably asleep. The lights inside the store were dim, and as I pushed open the door, a bell jingled overhead. There was a guy behind the counter, but he barely looked up when I came in. Just glanced at me, then went back to whatever he was doing on his phone. I grabbed a cup of coffee, paid for it, and headed back outside. That's when I saw them. 3 men, standing near the far end of the parking lot, by an old beat-up pickup truck. They weren't talking, just standing there, staring in my direction. At first, I thought maybe they were waiting for someone or just hanging out, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized they were watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe they were just truckers, same as me, waiting to hit the road. I took a sip of my coffee and started walking back to my truck. As I got closer, I noticed something else. One of the men had moved. He was standing closer now, about halfway between their truck and mine, like he'd been walking in my direction but stopped when I noticed him. The other 2 stayed by the pickup, still watching. I didn't like the way they were looking at me. It wasn't the usual glance you get from people when they're curious or bored. This was different, intense, like they were sizing me up. I felt my heart start to race, but I tried to stay calm. I just needed to get back in my truck and lock the doors. I could be out of there in minutes if I kept my cool. But when I reached the door of my rig, I realized I'd left the driver's side door unlocked. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd have to walk around to the other side to lock it from the inside. I didn't want to take my eyes off the men, but I had no choice. I circled around the truck as quickly as I could, and when I glanced back, the man who'd moved was even closer. He was walking toward me now, slow but deliberate. I yanked the passenger door open and scrambled inside, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked the driver's side door too. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, telling myself I was safe now that I was inside. But when I looked up, I saw that all 3 of them were standing right in front of my truck. They were just a few feet away, staring up at the cab like they were waiting for something. One of them, the tallest one, had a grin on his face, like he knew something I didn't. I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the engine started, but my hands were slick with sweat, and I kept dropping them. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Finally, I got the engine to turn over, and the headlights flicked on, illuminating the three men. They didn't move. I shifted into gear and started to pull forward, but one of the shorter men, stepped in front of the truck, blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes, not wanting to hit him, but he didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at me through the windshield, his face blank. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there, but I couldn't drive through him either. The tall one started to walk toward the driver's side door, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked sharp. My stomach dropped. I threw the truck into reverse, the tires screeching on the pavement as I backed up. The man in front of the truck stepped to the side, and I slammed my foot on the gas, pulling a hard turn to get out of there. The tall one ran toward the side of the truck, slamming his hand against the door as I sped away. I heard the thud of something metal hitting the side of the cab, but I didn't stop to look. I tore out of the parking lot, not caring if I was speeding, just wanting to put as much distance between me and them as possible. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see their pickup truck following me, but there was nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out behind me. I drove for a good hour before I finally pulled over at another truck stop, this one bigger and brighter, with other trucks parked outside and people milling around. I parked in the middle of the lot, where I could see everyone, and locked my doors before slumping back in my seat, trying to calm down. I sat there for a long time, thinking about what had happened. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to figure out if I'd done something to provoke them, but nothing made sense. They'd just been there, waiting, watching. And that look on their faces, it wasn't random. It was like they were expecting me, like they knew I'd be there. I didn't report it. I didn't think the cops would believe me, and even if they did, what would they do? Those men were long gone by now. I just wanted to forget it and move on, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there somewhere, watching the roads, waiting for someone else to stop at that lonely truck stop in the middle of the night. It started the night I lost my phone. I was at a party off campus, one of those big, crowded ones where people are packed shoulder to shoulder, music blaring so loud you can't hear yourself think. It wasn't really my scene, but my roommate, Chris, had dragged me along. Said it would be good for me to get out there and meet people. I remember checking my phone a couple of times during the night just to check the time, or respond to a couple of texts from another friend. At some point, I put it in my back pocket and didn't think about it again until later, when things started winding down, and I went to check the time. It wasn't there. I tried to stay calm at first, thinking maybe it had slipped out while I was sitting down or something. I checked the couch I'd been sitting on, even asked Chris and a couple of other people if they'd seen it. No one had. We looked around, but it was hard to see anything in the dark, and there were too many people milling around, stepping over everything. Eventually, I gave up. I figured I'd just left it somewhere in the house or maybe dropped it outside. Worst case, someone picked it up and would return it once they realized it wasn't theirs. I wasn't too worried at that point. I went home that night annoyed but not panicked. The next morning, I woke up and used Chris's phone to call mine. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. That's when I started to feel a little more uneasy. It was weird for it to be turned off. Even if the battery had died, Someone would have turned it on by now, right? I logged into the Find My Phone app on my laptop, hoping to see its location, but it couldn't find a signal. Dead battery, I figured. That's when I started getting the texts. It was around noon when the first one came through. It was from my own number. At first, I thought maybe someone had found my phone and was trying to return it. I opened the message. It was a picture of me. I stared at it for a second, not really understanding. It was a picture of me at the party, standing by the kitchen, talking to Chris. The angle of the photo was weird, though. Like it had been taken from behind something. And I hadn't noticed anyone taking it. I texted back immediately. Who is this? Where did you find my phone? No response. I started to feel that tight, uncomfortable feeling in my chest, like something wasn't right. I told myself it was probably just some idiot messing with me, trying to freak me out for fun. But why the picture? And how had they taken it without me noticing? A few minutes later, another text came through. This one wasn't a picture. It was just 3 words. I can see you. I froze. I was sitting at my desk, alone in my room. I hadn't left the apartment all morning. Slowly, I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain just a little to peek outside. Nothing. Just the usual view of the street and the row of houses across from mine. No one was outside. I started feeling stupid for getting so worked up. It was a joke. Had to be. Maybe someone at the party had grabbed my phone by accident and decided to screw with me before giving it back. I texted again, this time angrier. This isn't funny. Who are you? No reply. The rest of the day passed quietly. I tried to distract myself with homework, but my mind kept drifting back to those messages. I kept checking the Find My Phone app, hoping it would pop up, but it stayed offline. That night, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when another message came through. I hesitated before opening it. My hands felt clammy, and my heart was racing, though I didn't know why. It was another picture. This one was of my apartment building. Taken from the street. It was blurry, like whoever took it was in a hurry or moving. I jumped up from the couch and ran to the window again, pulling the curtain back hard and looking out into the night. No one. Just the same empty street. But they had been there. Someone had taken that picture. I didn't know what to do. I called Chris, told him about the texts, but he didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably just someone playing a prank, told me to relax. I wanted to believe him, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The next morning, the texts kept coming. More pictures. All of them were of me. Some were from the party, but others were new. One was of me walking to class that morning, my back to the camera. Another was of me sitting in the library later that afternoon, staring down at my notebook. Whoever had my phone was following me. I went to the campus police. They took down a report but didn't seem too interested. I guess they deal with a lot of lost or stolen phones, so they didn't really get how creepy this was. They told me to change my passwords and log out of any accounts that might be linked to my phone. I did that, but it didn't stop the messages. By that evening, I was too freaked out to go anywhere. I locked myself in my apartment, double-checking every window and door. Chris wasn't home. He was staying with his girlfriend for the night, so I was alone. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't check it, but I couldn't help myself. This time, the picture was of my apartment door. The front door. The one right outside my room. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and crept over to the peephole. The hallway was dark, and I couldn't see anyone. My hand shook as I gripped the door handle, unsure if I should open it or not. Then the next message came through. I'm inside. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. How could they be inside? The door had been locked all night, and I hadn't heard anything. But then again, I'd been so distracted with the messages, maybe I'd missed something. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and started checking the apartment. The living room, the bathroom, Chris's room, it was all empty. But when I got to my bedroom, I noticed something that made my heart drop. The window was open. Just a crack, but enough for someone to slip through. I ran to the window and slammed it shut, locking it. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the Find My Phone app again. This time, it worked. There was a signal. The phone was somewhere nearby. I stared at the little dot on the screen, watching as it moved closer. It was right outside my building now, heading toward the front door. I heard footsteps in the hallway. My chest tightened, and I turned off all the lights in my room, crouching down behind the bed. The footsteps got louder, closer. I could hear them right outside my apartment door. Then they stopped. There was a knock. Quiet at first, then louder. I didn't move. Another message. Let me in. I stayed where I was, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, but I didn't dare make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for any sign of movement. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stood up and peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I checked the app again. The signal was gone. My phone was offline. The messages stopped after that. For weeks, I kept expecting them to start again, but they didn't. I changed my number, got a new phone, but the fear stayed with me. Every time I walk down the street, I find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone's following me. I don't know who had my phone that night, or what they wanted. All I know is that they were close, too close. I was in New Orleans for the first time last summer. I'd always wanted to go. There's something about the city, you know? The history, the music, the food. And, of course, the ghosts. I'm not really a believer in all that, but when you're in a place like New Orleans, it's hard not to get caught up in it. I figured I'd try one of those haunted tours just for fun. I signed up for one on a whim. It was a small group, maybe 6 or 7 of us, led by a guy named Victor. He looked the part, tall, lanky, dressed in all black, with this old, beat-up leather hat that made him look like he stepped out of an old Western movie. His voice was low and slow, and he had this way of talking that made everything sound serious, like he knew things he wasn't telling you. The tour started off pretty normal. We went to the usual places, the LaLaurie Mansion, St. Louis Cemetery, stuff like that. Victor told us all the stories you'd expect about murders, ghosts, and strange sightings. He was good at it, though. I have to admit, I was starting to feel a little creeped out, even though I knew it was all just for show. About halfway through the tour, Victor stopped talking for a minute, and his eyes scanned the group. He smiled, but it wasn't the friendly kind of smile. It felt off, like he knew something we didn't. Then, out of nowhere, he told us we were going to take a detour, see a place that wasn't on the usual tour. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was part of the show, some extra spooky stop to make the tour more interesting. The rest of the group seemed excited too, so we all followed him as he led us down a narrow alleyway, away from the main streets. It was dark, and the further we went, the quieter it got. The sounds of the city faded, and before long, we were alone. No more tourists, no more bars, just us and Victor. He didn't say much as we walked, just kept glancing back at us with that weird smile on his face. The buildings around us were tall, their windows dark, and the streetlights didn't reach that far. I started feeling uneasy, but I didn't want to be the one to speak up and seem paranoid. After about 10 minutes of walking, Victor stopped in front of an old, crumbling building. It looked abandoned, like no one had lived there in years. The windows were boarded up, and the door was barely hanging on its hinges. He stood there for a moment, just staring at the building, like he was waiting for something. "This," he said, his voice quieter now, "is the real New Orleans. The part they don't tell you about." The way he said it made my skin crawl. One of the other tourists, a woman who had been chatting excitedly earlier, asked what the building was, but Victor didn't answer. He just walked up to the door and pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, and a rush of damp, stale air hit us. "Come inside," he said, stepping into the darkness. None of us moved at first. We all just stood there, staring at the open doorway. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, like this wasn't part of the tour anymore. But Victor was standing there, waiting, and we had come this far. Slowly, we followed him inside. The air inside was thick, heavy. It smelled like mold and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic, like blood. The floor was covered in dust and broken glass, and the walls were stained with dark patches. Victor didn't turn on any lights, didn't even have a flashlight. He just walked deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. We followed him, but the further we went, the more I regretted it. There was no way this was safe. The place felt like it was going to collapse at any moment, and there was something about the way Victor moved, the way he looked at us, that made my stomach turn. We reached a large room in the back of the building, and Victor finally stopped. He stood in the center of the room, his back to us, and for a long moment, no one said anything. We just stood there, waiting for him to do something, to say something, but he didn't. He just stood there, silent. One of the guys in the group finally spoke up, his voice nervous. "Ah, Victor? What is this place?" Victor turned around slowly, that strange smile still on his face. "This," he said, his voice low, "is where it all ends." My heart skipped a beat. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in on us. The rest of the group shifted uneasily, exchanging nervous glances. No one laughed. No one moved. Victor stepped closer to us, his eyes dark, his smile widening. "You wanted to see the real New Orleans, didn't you? The part they don't show you on the postcards?" One of the other tourists, a guy in his 20s, tried to laugh it off. "Okay, man, this is getting a little weird. Can we head back now?" Victor didn't answer. He just kept staring at us, that smile never leaving his face. I started to back away, my pulse racing. The others seemed to catch on that something was seriously wrong, and we all began inching toward the door, but Victor moved to block our path. His whole demeanor had changed. He wasn't just a creepy tour guide anymore. He was something else, something dangerous. "I wouldn't leave just yet," he said, his voice soft but menacing. "Not until I show you the truth." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My hands were shaking. I glanced at the others, and I could see the fear in their eyes too. We were all thinking the same thing. We needed to get out of there. Now! One of the women, the one who had asked about the building earlier, made a break for it. She pushed past Victor and bolted for the door. For a moment, I thought she'd make it, but then Victor moved, faster than I thought possible, grabbing her arm and yanking her back. She screamed, and that was it. The rest of us ran. I didn't look back. I heard more screams, more footsteps, but all I could think about was getting out of that building, getting away from Victor. I crashed through the front door, my heart pounding in my chest, and sprinted down the alley. The city was still quiet, too quiet, and it felt like the darkness was pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just ran, hoping to find my way back to the main streets, back to safety. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't stop to look. I just kept running, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I didn't stop until I saw the bright lights of a bar up ahead. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto a chair. The bartender looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I was safe. I was away from Victor. I never found out what happened to the others. I went to the police the next day, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. Said it was probably just a bad tour, that I'd gotten spooked. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything back. I still think about that night sometimes, about Victor and the others. I wonder if they ever made it out, or if they're still in that building, waiting for someone else to take the tour. I haven't been back to New Orleans since. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had been planning this weekend getaway for months. We both needed the break, especially after everything at work was getting too much. The cabin we found was in the middle of nowhere, about 3 hours out of the city. It looked perfect in the photos, quiet, cozy, right by a lake. The kind of place you could just relax, forget about everything. The guy who owned it, Alan, seemed nice enough when we spoke over the phone. He mentioned that he lived nearby and that we could call him if we needed anything. I didn't think much of it. Most people who own cabins like that usually live in the area, right? We got there Friday afternoon, and the drive up was actually pretty nice. The road leading to the cabin was mostly dirt and gravel, surrounded by trees for miles. When we pulled up, the place looked even better in person. A small, rustic cabin with a porch that overlooked the lake. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine trees was everywhere. Emily smiled as soon as we stepped out of the car. "This is perfect," she said. We unloaded the car, settled in, and everything felt right. The cabin was just as advertised, clean, cozy, and completely cut off from the outside world. No cell service, but there was a landline for emergencies, and we figured we wouldn't need to use it. We had a weekend to ourselves, just me and her. By the time the sun started to set, we had a fire going in the fireplace, and Emily had started making dinner. It felt like everything we'd hoped for, peaceful, private, just the two of us. That's when we heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was a little confused. I opened the door, and there was Alan, standing on the porch with a wide grin. He was an older guy, maybe mid-50s, with graying hair and a weathered face. He was dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, like he'd just come from chopping wood or something. "Just thought I'd stop by, make sure everything's okay," he said, his eyes glancing past me into the cabin. Yeah," I said, trying to sound polite. "Everything's great. We just got here and we're settling in." He nodded, still standing there like he was waiting for something. Good. I live just down the road if you need anything. Thought I'd give you a heads up about the weather too. Gets pretty cold out here at night." "We're all set," I assured him, trying to hint that we didn't need anything else. Alan lingered for a moment longer before finally nodding again. "All right then, I'll let you two get back to it. Have a good night." I closed the door and turned to Emily. She gave me a questioning look, but I just shrugged it off. He's probably just one of those overly friendly types, I said. Nothing to worry about. The rest of the night was uneventful. We ate dinner, played a few card games by the fire, and eventually went to bed. I forgot all about Alan until the next morning. I woke up early, the sun just starting to rise, and when I looked out the window, I saw him. Alan. He was standing near the edge of the woods, not too far from the cabin, just watching. He wasn't doing anything, not cutting wood, not walking a dog. Just standing there, staring at the cabin. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't want to freak Emily out. Maybe he was just checking on us again, I told myself. But something about the way he stood there, not moving, made me feel uneasy. I waited until he finally turned and walked back into the woods before I told Emily. She was getting ready for breakfast, and when I mentioned it, she frowned. "That's weird," she said. "Why would he be out there so early?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe he's just keeping an eye on the property." We both tried to brush it off, but the mood had shifted. The rest of the morning felt tense, like we were both waiting for something to happen. Around noon, we decided to go for a walk by the lake. It was beautiful, and for a while, I forgot about the weirdness from earlier. We took some photos, skipped rocks, and everything felt normal again. When we got back to the cabin, though, the front door was slightly open. I stopped in my tracks, and Emily grabbed my arm. "Did you leave it like that?" she whispered. I shook my head. "No." I was sure I had locked it before we left. We stepped inside slowly, and nothing seemed out of place at first. But there was this feeling like someone had been in there. I checked the bedroom, the bathroom, everywhere, but nothing was missing, nothing was moved. Still, the door had definitely been open, and we both knew it. I went outside, looking around, but there was no sign of Alan or anyone else. Just trees and the quiet sound of the lake in the distance. When I came back in, Emily looked worried. "Maybe we should leave," she said. "I think we're overreacting," I tried to reassure her, though I didn't fully believe it myself. "Let's just stay one more night. If anything else weird happens, we'll go." She reluctantly agreed, but I could tell she wasn't comfortable. Neither of us were, really. The rest of the day was spent in a weird silence. We didn't talk much, didn't do much, just sat around, waiting. That night, as soon as it got dark, I heard footsteps outside. Soft at first, like someone walking around the cabin. I froze, listening. Emily was in the bedroom, and I didn't want to scare her, but I couldn't ignore it. I got up slowly, peeking out the window, and there he was again, Alan. He was pacing, circling the cabin, like he was inspecting it or something. I watched him for a while, my heart racing. He didn't knock this time, didn't say anything. Just kept walking, slow and deliberate. It felt like he was waiting for us to do something. I grabbed my phone, but of course, no service. I cursed under my breath, trying to think. Should I confront him? Tell him to leave us alone? But something about the way he was acting made me hesitate. He didn't seem like the friendly old guy from before. There was something off, something dangerous. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I waited, listening, but everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Emily. We both stayed up, listening, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, we packed up. I didn't care that we had paid for another night, we weren't staying. As we loaded the car, I glanced around, half expecting Alan to show up again, but he didn't. Just as we were about to leave, though, he appeared from the woods, walking toward us with that same unsettling smile. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something came up. We have to head back early." He nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe me. "That's too bad. You didn't get to enjoy the full experience." I didn't respond. I just wanted to get out of there. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Alan standing there, watching us until we were out of sight. I didn't feel safe until we were miles down the road, and even then, it wasn't until we were back home that I could finally relax. I don't know what Alan's deal was. Maybe he was just lonely, or maybe he was more dangerous than that. Either way, I'm never going back to that cabin again. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought I had lucked out. It was my first time living on my own, and the place was cheap but clean. It had everything I needed: a decent-sized kitchen, a nice view of the city from the living room, and a bedroom that, while small, was cozy enough. It wasn't in the best part of town, but I didn't mind. I wanted my own space, and this was within my budget. For the first couple of weeks, things were fine. I was busy settling in, getting used to my new job, and figuring out the neighborhood. I didn't know many people, but I liked the quiet. The building was older, and the walls were thin, so I could hear my neighbors now and then, but it wasn't anything unusual. That's when I started to notice him. My apartment faced the street, and directly across from me was another unit. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the windows across from mine. The blinds were always drawn, and there was no sign of anyone living there. But one night, I came home late from work, and as I was getting ready for bed, I saw a figure standing by the window. He was just standing there, staring out at nothing. I couldn't see much of his face because the room behind him was dark, but I could tell it was a man. Something about the way he stood there, completely still, made me feel uneasy. I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe he was just someone who liked to look out the window at night. The next morning, I glanced over at the window again as I was making coffee, and he was still there. He hadn't moved. He was just standing there, staring out again, like a statue. I tried not to think about it too much. People have weird habits, right? Maybe he worked odd hours and just liked standing there. It wasn't until the third or fourth night that it really started to get to me. Every night, without fail, he was there. Always in the same spot, always staring out. At first, I tried to convince myself that he wasn't actually looking at me, just out at the street or something. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like his eyes were fixed on my window. I started closing my blinds at night, but even then, I could feel him. I'd be in bed, trying to sleep, and I'd get this overwhelming sense that he was watching. I checked my door, made sure everything was locked, but that uneasiness never left. Then, one night, I came home and found my front door unlocked. I always lock my door. Always. Living in that part of town, you couldn't be too careful. But when I got home that night, the door was slightly open. I froze in the hallway, my heart racing. I tried to remember if I'd forgotten to lock it that morning, but I knew I hadn't. I'm obsessive about things like that. I don't leave until I check the lock at least twice. I didn't want to go inside, but I didn't have a choice. It was my apartment, after all. I slowly pushed the door open, stepping inside. Nothing looked out of place. The furniture was where I left it, and there was no sign of anything missing. But that feeling, that sense of being watched, was stronger than ever. I went through the whole apartment, checking every room, every closet, even under the bed. There was no one there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. Maybe it was the neighbor. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After that, I started double-checking the locks, even putting a chair in front of the door at night. It wasn't enough, though. I still couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there in the window, watching me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It wasn't like he was actually dangerous, right? He was just a weird guy who never left his apartment. Maybe he had some kind of issue, something that kept him indoors. I tried to rationalize it, but every night, the feeling got worse. One evening, I got home from work later than usual. It was raining, and the streets were empty. I hurried inside, drenched, and tossed my bag on the couch. I was about to grab a towel when I saw it. The blinds on the window across the street were open, and there he was, staring right at me. Not out at the street, not at the sky, but directly at my window. I froze, the towel slipping out of my hand. For the first time, I could see his face. Pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed too big for his head. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. I backed away from the window, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off him, though. It was like I was trapped, held in place by his gaze. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I knew I had to do something. Maybe report him? But report him for what? Watching me from his own apartment? It wasn't illegal. But I couldn't live like this. I couldn't keep feeling like I was being watched all the time. The next day, I asked the building manager about the guy in the unit across from mine. She looked confused for a second before telling me that the apartment had been vacant for months. No one had rented it out since the last tenant moved out 6 months ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. That couldn't be right. I had seen him every night. Every single night, standing there, watching me. I tried to argue, telling her that I had seen someone living there, but she just shook her head. You must be mistaken. There's no one living there, she said. I didn't know what to think. Was I losing my mind? Was I seeing things that weren't there? I started to doubt myself, but deep down, I knew what I saw. That night, I locked the door, double-checked it, and even barricaded it with a chair. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for... I didn't know what. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, right outside my door. I held my breath, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard the doorknob jiggle. I shot out of bed, grabbing my phone, ready to call the police. The door didn't open, though. Whoever was out there gave up after a few seconds, and the footsteps retreated down the hallway. I didn't sleep at all that night. First thing in the morning, I packed up my things and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't care if I had to break the lease. I wasn't going to spend another night in that apartment. I moved out the next day, staying with a friend until I could find a new place. I never saw that man again, but sometimes, late at night, I still feel like someone's watching me. I'd been planning this hike for months. My job was wearing me down, and I needed a break from everything, so I decided to take a week off and head to the Rockies. It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing crazy, just me, some gear, and nature. I'd done a few solo hikes before, but nothing as remote as this. Still, I figured I could handle it. I liked the quiet, the solitude. I set out early that morning. The trail I'd picked was marked as moderate, and I wasn't expecting any surprises. The first few miles were pretty standard, well-trodden paths, occasional signs to remind you where you were. I passed a couple of other hikers, but for the most part, it was just me. The sun was high by the time I hit what I thought was the halfway point. I stopped to take a break, eat something, and get my bearings. The map showed a small stream about a mile further ahead, so I figured I'd refill my water there. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There was a rope tied to a tree, just off the main path. At first, I thought it was some kind of marker, maybe left by another hiker or part of some trail maintenance. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just a random rope. It was thick, old-looking, and it led deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I wasn't sure what to make of it. It didn't seem like something you'd see in a national park. I stood there for a minute, debating if I should follow it. In hindsight, I should have just kept walking, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the rope for about 10 or 15 minutes, winding through trees and brush. It wasn't easy to keep track of, but every time it looked like it might stop, I'd find another piece tied to a different tree, leading me further in. That's when I came across the first marker. It was a small wooden sign, nailed to a tree, and it had an arrow pointing down a narrow path. The writing was faded, but I could make out something that looked like a name. I don't know why, but something about it gave me the creeps. It didn't seem official, like it wasn't meant to be there. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I kept walking, following the signs and ropes deeper into the forest. After a while, I realized the path wasn't natural. It was man-made, like someone had cut it out of the trees and bushes. It wasn't a trail you'd find on any map. That's when I saw the first trap. I nearly walked right into it. It was a snare, hidden under some leaves and branches, with a thin wire stretched between two trees. If I hadn't been looking down at the time, I would have tripped right into it. I stepped back, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would someone set a trap out here? It didn't make any sense. This wasn't hunting season, and even if it was, this wasn't the kind of trap you'd use for animals. It was too deliberate, too well hidden. It felt wrong. I took a few steps back, trying to calm myself down, but then I noticed something else. There were more traps. I could see them now, scattered along the hidden path, each one different from the last. Some were snares, others looked like pits, covered with loose brush. Whoever had set these traps wasn't just trying to catch animals, they were trying to catch something bigger. Something human. I turned around, ready to head back to the main trail, but then I heard a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, straining to hear if it was just an animal, but then I heard it again. It was closer this time. I didn't see anyone, but I knew someone was there. I could feel it. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, so I started walking back the way I came, faster now, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every rustle of leaves felt like a gunshot. As I made my way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. I didn't run, I didn't want to set off any of the traps I hadn't noticed, but I moved as quickly as I could, hoping I wasn't too far from the main trail. That's when I saw it. Another rope, tied between two trees, blocking my way back. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. Someone had set it while I was following the path. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. If I went under it, I'd be right in their line of sight. If I went around, I'd be moving into unknown territory. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, partially hidden behind the trees, watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but they were tall, wearing dark clothes. They didn't move, didn't say anything, they just stood there, watching. Panic set in. I couldn't go back the way I came, and I couldn't stay where I was. I had to keep moving, keep looking for a way out. I veered off the path, into the dense underbrush, trying to lose them, but every time I thought I was alone, I'd hear something, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, and I'd know they were still there, following me. It felt like hours, but eventually, I stumbled back onto the main trail. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I just kept walking, fast, trying to put as much distance between me and whatever was back there. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if they were still watching. When I finally made it back to my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, driving as fast as I could. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'm not going back there. I've tried to look up information about the area, but I haven't found anything. No reports of strange activity, no missing hikers, nothing. It's like it never happened. But I know what I saw. It had been a long drive. I'd been on the road for almost 12 hours, and the only thing on my mind was finding a place to rest. I wasn't picky about where I stayed, just somewhere clean and quiet. I saw the old motel from the road and figured it would be fine for the night. The sign was barely legible, and the place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but I was too tired to care. I pulled up to the front desk and was greeted by the manager, an older man with a warm smile. He was friendly, almost too friendly. He chatted with me as he checked me in, telling me about the area and offering me a cup of coffee. I was polite but just wanted to get to my room and crash. He gave me the key to room 12 and pointed me in the direction of the building. I thanked him and went to find my room. The hallway was dimly lit, and the carpets looked worn and stained. My room was exactly what I expected, basic, with old furniture and a musty smell. I checked the bed, making sure it was clean enough, and then took a quick shower to wash off the road grime. After I got into bed, I was finally able to relax. It was quiet, but the silence didn't last long. I started to hear noises outside my room. At first, it was just the occasional bump or creak, probably just the old building settling. But then I heard what sounded like footsteps. Not the kind of footsteps you hear from people walking down the hall, but something heavier and closer. I tried to ignore it and pulled the covers over my head. But the noises kept coming. I could hear murmurs and the sound of something scraping against the door. I got up to check it out, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. The hallway was empty and silent. I went back inside and locked the door, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the noises didn't stop. I started to feel uneasy, like something was wrong. I decided to call the front desk to see if they could send someone to check it out. I picked up the phone, but it was dead. I tried again, but there was no dial tone. I got up to look for the phone jack, and that's when I noticed the door. The lock was different from what I remembered. There was no way to unlock it from the inside. I went to the window to see if I could escape that way, but it was sealed shut. Panic set in. I tried the door handle, but it was stuck. I pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear the noises getting closer now, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. I started banging on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. The noises outside stopped, and I was left in complete silence. I felt like I was going crazy. I tried calling the manager's office again, but the phone still wouldn't work. Minutes felt like hours. I was terrified, and I could feel my anxiety rising. I was sure that someone was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to come in. I tried to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. I heard the faint sound of footsteps walking away from my door. I waited in silence, listening intently. After what felt like forever, I finally heard the sound of the key turning in the lock. The manager's face appeared in the doorway, looking genuinely concerned. He said he'd heard me banging on the door and came to check it out. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked him what was going on, but he just reassured me that everything was fine and apologized for the disturbance. I didn't trust him, but I didn't have any choice but to go along with it. I gathered my things quickly, determined to get out of there. I told him I was leaving and asked for a refund, which he reluctantly gave me. I packed up my stuff and left the motel, not caring where I went as long as it was far from there. I drove for a few more hours until I found another place to stay. I still don't know what happened that night, and I'm still haunted by the feeling of being trapped and watched. I've never gone back to that motel, and I've never stayed in a place like that again. Sometimes I wonder if it was all in my head, but the fear felt too real. I just hope I never have to experience anything like that again. I've been working at this convenience store for about 6 months. It's not a big place, just a small spot off the highway. Most of the customers are truckers, or people passing through, looking for gas and snacks. The night shift is long, usually quiet, and honestly, I like it that way. It's not the kind of place where anything really happens. At least, I thought that until this guy started showing up. He came in for the first time about 3 weeks ago, maybe around 2 a.m. I didn't think much of it at first. He just walked in, looked around, and didn't buy anything. That's not that weird, right? Some people just browse or grab a drink before heading out. But then he came back the next night, at the same time, doing the exact same thing. It was weird because he didn't seem to be looking for anything specific. He'd just wander around the aisles, glancing at the shelves, checking out the candy, chips, and drinks. Never grabbed anything, though. I tried making small talk with him once, asking if he needed help finding something. He just smiled with this creepy, tight-lipped smile and shook his head. The thing is, he didn't really seem like a customer. He didn't look like he was in a hurry to be anywhere. Just taking his time, hanging around. And then, after about 30 minutes or so, he'd leave. I didn't think much of it until it started happening every night. Same guy, same time, same routine. By the 5th night, I was starting to feel uneasy about it. He was always alone, never said a word, just gave me that strange smile before heading out. It wasn't like he was doing anything wrong, but there was something about him that put me on edge. He wore the same clothes every time, dark jeans, a gray hoodie with the hood up, and sneakers. His face was pale, almost sickly looking, and his eyes were these dull, flat blue. I'd be stocking the shelves or sweeping, and I could feel him watching me. Not staring exactly, but I always knew when he was looking. I didn't tell anyone at first because it seemed so minor. I mean, what was I gonna say? Some guy keeps coming in but not buying anything? Who cares, right? But the longer it went on, the more it started messing with me. One night, I decided to watch him more closely. I stayed behind the counter, pretending to do paperwork while keeping an eye on him. He didn't touch anything, didn't even seem interested in what was on the shelves. He'd just walk around, lingering, glancing toward the door or the window, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. When he finally left, I was so relieved. I even locked the door after he walked out, which I never do during my shift. I don't know why I felt like I had to, but something about him just didn't sit right. Then, about a week ago, things took a turn. It was a slow night, like most nights, and I was sitting behind the counter, sipping on some coffee to keep myself awake. Sure enough, right around 2 a.m., he walked in. I had gotten used to the routine by then, but something was different that night. He wasn't just wandering around like usual. He kept looking over at me, more than he had before. Like, really watching me this time. I tried to ignore it, but then he walked up to the counter, standing just a few feet away. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there. I asked him if he needed help, like I had before. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in a bit and said, "Can you come outside with me? I need help with something." That smile was gone. His face was blank, and his eyes, God, they looked almost dead. There was something cold and flat about them. It wasn't like he was asking for a favor. It felt like he was telling me to come outside, not asking. I shook my head, told him I couldn't leave the store. Store policy and all that. He didn't seem to care about my excuse. He just stood there, staring at me for a long moment before he finally turned around and walked out. I watched him leave, and I thought that was it. But about 15 minutes later, I noticed something strange. He hadn't driven off. His car, this old beat-up sedan that had been parked out front, was still there, but I didn't see him. I looked around the lot through the security cameras, but there was no sign of him. I was starting to get really freaked out at this point. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby, watching. I locked the door again, just to be safe, and tried to focus on finishing my shift. But every little noise had me on edge, the hum of the refrigerators, the wind outside, the creak of the building settling. Eventually, my shift ended, and the morning guy came in to take over. I left as quickly as I could, trying to forget about the whole thing. But when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept thinking about that guy, the way he'd asked me to come outside. It just didn't sit right. Then, the next night, when I came in for my shift, I found something strange behind the counter. It was a small piece of paper, folded up neatly. I hadn't seen it when I left the store earlier that morning, and no one else should have been back there. I unfolded it, and my stomach dropped. It was a note, just 3 words written in sloppy, uneven handwriting. "I'm still here." I panicked. I checked the cameras, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I looked around the store, making sure everything was locked up tight. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That some guy had been coming in every night, and now I found a creepy note. It wasn't enough. It wasn't proof of anything. I tried to brush it off, but every noise outside had me jumping. I couldn't concentrate. I spent the entire shift watching the door, waiting for him to come back, but he didn't. It felt like he was playing some kind of game with me, testing how far he could push before I snapped. The next few nights were quiet. No sign of him. No more notes. I thought maybe he had finally moved on, but something inside me knew it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. I kept thinking about those words, "I'm still here." Last night, it escalated. I was getting ready to close up the store when I heard footsteps outside. I checked the cameras, and there he was, standing just outside the door, staring in through the glass. He didn't move, didn't try to come inside, just stood there, watching me. I froze. My heart was racing, and I didn't know what to do. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at me. Just pointed. I don't know why, but it terrified me. I backed away from the counter, my hands shaking, and that's when he smiled again. That same tight-lipped, creepy smile. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them someone was outside the store, acting suspicious. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign of him anywhere. The officer told me to call again if he came back, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Now, I'm sitting here at home, still trying to make sense of it. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I know one thing for sure. He's not gone. I was driving back from Fairbanks. It was late, probably close to midnight. The highway was mostly empty, nothing but the open road stretching for miles ahead. The sky was this deep shade of blue, fading into black, and the only sound was the low hum of the car engine. It wasn't unusual for me to drive at night in Alaska, especially on this highway. Not a lot of traffic, just long stretches of road with nothing around but trees and mountains in the distance. I had left a little later than I planned, and now it was getting colder. I could feel the temperature dropping even with the heat on in the car. The darkness out there, it was thick. It felt like you could reach out and touch it. The headlights barely cut through it, just illuminating a few feet ahead before the blackness swallowed everything else. I was about an hour or so away from my destination when I saw it. A pile of debris in the middle of the road. Logs, branches, rocks, stuff that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a landslide, it looked like someone had put it there deliberately, like a makeshift roadblock. I slowed down, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Something about it didn't feel right. This wasn't some random stuff that had just fallen from the trees. The logs were neatly stacked, the branches arranged like someone had taken the time to make it look like an accident. I stopped the car, the engine still running. I thought about just driving around it, but the way the logs were positioned, it would have been hard. And the last thing I needed was to get stuck out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service. I glanced at my phone, but as expected, there were no bars. I put the car in park and got out. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I zipped up my jacket and started walking toward the roadblock, trying to figure out the best way to move some of the debris out of the way. I didn't see anyone around, just the trees on either side of the road, stretching out into the darkness. That's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, leading away from the pile and into the forest. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints were deep, like someone had been standing there recently, watching. My heart started to race. I stood up, scanning the tree line, but it was too dark to see much of anything beyond the first few rows of trees. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone had tried to clear the road earlier and then gave up. But something about it didn't sit right. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back to the car, ready to just forget about the whole thing and try to drive around the mess. That's when I saw the truck. It was parked a little ways behind my car, its headlights off, just sitting there in the dark. I hadn't heard it pull up. I hadn't seen it on the road. It was like it had appeared out of nowhere. The driver's side door opened, and a man got out. He was tall, wearing a thick coat and a beanie, but I couldn't make out much of his face in the darkness. He started walking toward me, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Need some help?" he called out, his voice carrying through the cold night air. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know this guy. I didn't know where he'd come from, and something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, set off alarm bells in my head. "No, I'm good," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got it." He kept walking toward me, ignoring what I'd said. He was maybe 20 feet away now, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. "You sure? Looks like a pretty big mess to clear on your own." His tone was casual, but there was something off about it. Too casual, like he was trying too hard to sound helpful. I said I'm fine, I repeated, a little louder this time. He stopped, just standing there, watching me. We stared at each other for a moment, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Then he smiled. It was a small, tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think you are." That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. The roadblock, the truck, the footprints, it was all planned. He'd been waiting for someone to come along, someone like me. I took a step back, my mind racing. I needed to get back to the car, lock the doors, and get the hell out of there. But before I could move, I heard something behind me, a rustling in the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I whipped around, but I couldn't see anything. Just the dark outline of the trees, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But the footsteps were getting closer, faster, like someone was running toward me. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted for the car, my boots slipping on the icy pavement. I could hear the man behind me now, his footsteps quickening as he gave chase. I reached the car, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the door handle. I yanked it open and dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The man was standing just a few feet away from the car now, his face illuminated by the glow of my headlights. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was blank, cold. He took a step closer, and I could see something glinting in his hand. A knife. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed away from the roadblock. The man lunged forward, slamming his hand against the window, but I was already moving, the car skidding as I turned and sped down the highway. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I was going, just away from him, away from that roadblock and those footprints leading into the forest. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I finally let myself breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over, my mind racing with what had just happened. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. I've been fishing this lake for years. It's one of those places where you don't see many people, especially at night. Just the water, the trees, and the sounds of the woods around you. It's quiet, and that's why I liked it. No noise, no distractions. Just me, my rod, and the fish. That night, I had it out just like I always do. The sun was setting, casting this orange glow over the lake, and by the time I got to the shore, it was already starting to get dark. I launched my small boat, a little old aluminum thing, nothing fancy, but it did the job. I had my lantern, a cooler of beer, and enough bait to last me until the early morning. It was calm, barely a ripple on the water, and the air was cool. I rowed out a bit, not too far, just to where I knew the fish liked to gather. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet where you can hear the smallest splash, the tiniest breeze rustling through the trees. I cast my line, cracked open a beer, and leaned back, watching the moon rise over the treetops. For a while, it was perfect. I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to ease as I settled into the rhythm of the night. Just me and the lake. But then, I noticed something. A light, far off across the water. It wasn't uncommon for people to come out here, but not at this time of night. The light was moving slowly, like someone was rowing. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. A boat, definitely. I could see the outline of it now, the glow of a lantern hanging off the side, like mine. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a big lake, plenty of room for more than one boat. But as the minutes passed, I realized they were coming closer. Real slow. I tried to ignore it. Focused on my line, checked the bait. But I kept glancing up. They weren't heading straight across the lake like they had somewhere to go. They were drifting, zigzagging. It was like they were taking their time, watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were just looking for a spot to fish, like me. Nothing wrong with that. The boat got closer, close enough that I could see there were 3 of them. 3 men, sitting there in the boat, all quiet. No talking, no movement. Just sitting there, watching me. Their faces were mostly in shadow, but the lantern lit them up just enough to see their eyes, all locked on me. I waved, just to be polite. Evening, I called out, trying to sound casual. They didn't say anything. Didn't wave back. Just kept watching. I started to feel uneasy, like maybe I shouldn't be out here after all. Something about the way they were just sitting there, staring, didn't feel right. After a few more minutes of silence, I decided to pack it in. I didn't like the vibe, and I wasn't catching anything anyway. I reeled in my line, stowed my gear, and grabbed the oars, ready to row back to shore. That's when they moved. Not fast, just a slow, deliberate row, bringing their boat even closer to mine. Too close now. Close enough that I could hear the creak of their oars in the water, the slap of the wood against the surface. I could see their faces better now, but they were still hard to make out in the dim light. "Y'all need something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel my pulse starting to race. Still, they didn't answer. Just stared. One of them, the guy sitting at the back, stood up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing some kind of old jacket. His face was in shadow, but I could see his eyes glinting in the lantern light. Then he pulled something out of his jacket. A knife. It wasn't a small one either. Long, with a serrated edge that caught the light for just a second as he held it up. The other 2 men stayed seated, but they were watching me closely, like they were waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't wait. I grabbed the oars and started rowing, fast. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I pulled on the oars as hard as I could. I could hear the water slapping against their boat as they started to follow me, faster now. They weren't talking. There were no shouts, no threats. Just the sound of their boat cutting through the water, getting closer with every stroke. I rowed harder, the cold air biting in my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced back over my shoulder, and they were right behind me, their boat moving faster than mine, closing the distance with every second. I wasn't going to make it. They were too fast, and my arms were already burning from the effort. I could see the shore, but it was too far. I was out in the middle of the lake, and they were going to catch up to me before I could get anywhere near it. Panic set in. I wasn't thinking straight, just rowing, desperate to get away. But the harder I rowed, the more I realized it wasn't going to work. They were too close now. I could hear their boat scraping up alongside mine, the creak of wood against wood as they pulled up next to me. I dropped the oars and lunged for the motor. It was old, temperamental, but I didn't have a choice. My hands fumbled with the pull cord, yanking it over and over, praying it would start. Behind me, I heard the thud of boots as one of them stepped onto my boat. The metal hull creaked under his weight. I yanked the cord again, harder this time, and finally, the motor sputtered to life. The boat jerked forward, throwing the guy off balance. He stumbled, reaching for me, but I was already moving, the motor roaring as I sped across the water. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept going, the cold wind stinging my face, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was at the shore, my boat scraping against the rocks as I jumped out, my legs shaking as I scrambled onto land. I looked back once, just for a second, and saw their boat drifting in the middle of the lake, their lantern still glowing faintly in the distance. They weren't following me anymore. They were just sitting there, watching. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'm never going back to that lake again. I've always liked camping alone. It's something about the quiet, the stillness, being away from everyone and everything. People say it's weird for a woman to go out into the woods by herself, but I never saw it that way. I've done it plenty of times, and nothing ever happened. This time was no different, or at least, it didn't start out that way. I'd planned to stay for a weekend, just me, my tent, and enough food to last a couple of days. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far enough from any roads or trails that I wouldn't run into other campers. That was the point, to be alone. The first day was fine. I set up my tent, built a fire, and spent the day hiking around. There wasn't much to see except trees and the occasional stream, but that's what I liked about it. It was peaceful. I didn't have to talk to anyone, didn't have to worry about anything. As the sun went down, I got back to my campsite, cooked some food, and settled in for the night. It was cold, but I was prepared for that. I had a thick sleeping bag, extra blankets, the works. The fire crackled beside me as I sat there, watching the stars appear overhead. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard something. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it was there. Voices. I froze, listening. It wasn't the kind of noise you expect to hear out there, miles away from anyone. It sounded like a conversation, though I couldn't make out any words. It was coming from somewhere far off, maybe deeper in the woods, but close enough that I could hear the low murmur of it. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me. It was late, I was tired, and the woods can make all sorts of strange noises when you're alone. Still, it bothered me. I sat up straighter, straining to hear it again. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. But then, I heard it again. Louder this time. Definite voices. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it in the direction the sound was coming from. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, the same as before. No people, no movement. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky, but I forced myself to speak louder. "Is someone out there?" Silence. The voices stopped, and all I could hear was the wind again. I stood there for a long time, just listening, my heart pounding in my chest. But after a few minutes, the woods were quiet again. I went back to my fire, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe some campers further out than I thought. But it didn't sit right with me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise outside my tent made me jump. I kept my flashlight close, the zipper of the tent slightly open so I could peek out if I needed to. But nothing happened, and eventually, I drifted off. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that something felt wrong. The air felt colder, heavier. I sat up, blinking in the early light, and that's when I realized my fire was out. Not just burnt down, but completely cold, like it had been out for hours. That's when I saw the footprints. They were everywhere, all around my tent. I could see them clearly in the dirt, circling the campsite, overlapping in places. There had to be at least 3 or 4 sets of them, all leading in different directions, as if whoever had made them had been walking around my tent for hours. I felt my stomach drop. My first thought was that someone had been watching me while I slept. The voices from the night before came rushing back into my head, and I stood up, my heart racing as I looked around the campsite. That's when I noticed my supplies were gone. Not everything, just enough to make it unsettling. My food, my extra blanket, my water bottle. All of it was gone, but my tent and sleeping bag were untouched. It was like someone had come in during the night and taken what they needed, without waking me. I searched the area, looking for more signs of whoever had been there. The footprints led off into the woods in every direction, like they'd scattered after taking my things. I followed one set for a while, but they just disappeared after a few yards, as if whoever made them had just vanished. I went back to my campsite, trying to stay calm. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. It could have been other campers, sure, but why would they take my things and leave everything else? Why didn't they wake me up or say something? I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up my remaining gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my backpack. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. By the time I was ready to leave, the sun was higher in the sky, but the woods still felt off. The air was too quiet, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. I started hiking back towards my car, keeping a tight grip on my flashlight even though it was daylight. Every little sound made me jump at the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, following me. About halfway back to the trailhead, I heard it again. The voices. They were faint, just like the night before, but they were there. Low, murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. The voices seemed to be coming from up ahead, deeper into the woods. But I couldn't see anyone. The trail was empty, just trees and underbrush as far as I could see. I didn't want to go any further, but I didn't have a choice. My car was still a good hour's hike away, and there was no way I was going to turn back and spend another night out there. I kept moving, faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices seemed to follow me, getting louder as I went. I couldn't make out any words, but I knew they were talking about me. I could feel it. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the trailhead. My car was parked just beyond it, in the small clearing where I'd left it. Relief washed over me as I picked up my pace, almost running the last few steps to the car. But as I reached the clearing, I stopped short. There, standing beside my car, was a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face partially hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me as I approached. I froze, my hand tightening around the strap of my backpack. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The man didn't say anything. He just kept staring. I took a step back, my heart racing. "What do you want?" Still nothing. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and ran back down the trail, not caring where it led, just needing to get away. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran, branches whipping against my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually the footsteps faded, and I found myself alone in the woods again. I never went back to that car. I never thought anything like this would happen to me. I work late shifts at this office building downtown, and for the most part, it's just routine. The office gets quiet after everyone leaves, the phones stop ringing, and the fluorescent lights cast this strange glow over everything. It's not like I'm afraid of being there alone. Honestly, I kinda like the silence. I'd usually leave around 10 or 11, and by that time, the parking garage was mostly empty, except for a few other cars that belonged to people working late shifts too. That night, I finished up some work and headed out like I always do. I remember being tired, more tired than usual. My mind was in that foggy space where you just want to get home, not thinking about much else. The elevator dinged when I hit the button for the garage level, and I just stood there, waiting for it to reach the bottom. When the doors opened, the garage was dead silent, like always. Just rows of empty cars, the dim lights humming above me. My car was parked a bit further back, near the exit ramp. I could see it from the elevator, this beat-up Honda I've had for years. I started walking towards it, footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. As I got closer, I noticed another car parked a few spots away. Nothing unusual, except this one had its engine running. That struck me as odd, because usually, at this time, no one else is around. It was this black sedan, one of those nondescript types you see all the time but never really pay attention to. The headlights were on, and I could hear the low rumble of the engine. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was just about to leave, same as me. But as I reached my car, I realized something strange. No one was in the driver's seat of the other car. The engine was running, but the car was empty. That made me pause. I stood there for a second, staring at the car. Why would someone leave their engine running in an empty parking garage? It didn't make sense. I looked around, half expecting to see someone come out from behind one of the pillars, but the place was deserted. Just me, my car, and that empty sedan. I told myself to stop being paranoid. Maybe the driver had just run inside to grab something, or maybe they'd forgotten to turn off the engine. Whatever it wasn't my problem. I unlocked my car, threw my bag in the passenger seat, and got in. As soon as I started my engine, the sedan's headlights flickered. I glanced over, and for the first time, I noticed something else. The back windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside, but there was something about the way the car was positioned that felt off. Like it was waiting. I tried to shake it off. I backed out of my spot, pulling towards the exit ramp, but just as I did, the sedan's engine revved, and it started moving too. Now, I've been in parking garages a million times, and usually, if another car pulls out at the same time as you, it's no big deal. But this felt different. The way the sedan moved, it wasn't just pulling out to leave. It was following me. I took the ramp slowly, the tires squealing a little as I turned the corner. The sedan followed, staying just close enough that I could see its headlights in my rearview mirror. My heart started pounding a bit, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. At the first stoplight outside the garage, I turned left, onto a side street that I don't usually take. I figured if they were going the same direction, it wouldn't mean anything. People turn the same way all the time, right? But when I looked in the mirror, the sedan was right behind me. I didn't want to panic, but something about this felt wrong. I turned again, onto a quieter street, thinking maybe they'd go another way. But they didn't. Every turn I made, the sedan stayed right behind me, its headlights reflecting in my mirror like a pair of eyes watching me. I tried to calm myself down. There had to be an explanation. Maybe they just lived in the same direction. Maybe they didn't even notice me. But the longer this went on, the more uneasy I felt. I took a few more random turns, hoping to shake them. I wasn't going home, not yet. I didn't want them to know where I lived. I didn't want them to follow me all the way there. But every time I looked in the mirror, They were still there, creeping up close, then backing off, then creeping up again. After a while, I decided to try something different. There's a gas station not too far from my place, open 24 hours. I figured if I pulled in there, maybe they'd keep driving, maybe this was all in my head. I turned into the station, pulling up to one of the pumps, and killed the engine. The sedan slowed down, and for a moment, I thought they were going to drive past. But then, they pulled into the station too, parking a few spots away. I sat there for a second, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The sedan just sat there, engine running, lights on, but no one got out. That was when I started to feel real fear. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. This was deliberate. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Get out of the car and confront them? My heart was racing, and my mind was spinning with all kinds of terrible thoughts. Before I could make a decision, the sedan's driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up, so I couldn't see his face clearly. He stood there for a moment, looking in my direction, then he started walking towards my car. That was it. I wasn't waiting to find out what he wanted. I turned the key in the ignition, my hand shaking as the engine sputtered to life. The man stopped, standing still for a moment, then he started walking faster. I floored it, the tires screeching as I sped out of the gas station. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the sedan pull out of the station, its headlights swinging around to follow me. I started weaving through side streets, trying to lose them. Every time I thought I'd shaken them, they'd show up again, just behind me, their headlights flashing in the darkness. I couldn't believe this was happening. It didn't feel real. I felt like I was in a nightmare, like I'd wake up any second and it would all be over. But it wasn't. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted a police station up ahead. I swerved into the parking lot, and the sedan slowed down, its headlights flickering for a moment before it sped off in the opposite direction. I sat there in my car, gasping for breath, my hands still shaking as I watched them disappear into the night. I never got a good look at the man's face. I don't know why he was following me, or what he wanted. But I haven't been back to that parking garage since. Now, every time I leave work late, I make sure I park somewhere well lit, and I always check my rearview mirror, just in case. I showed up to work a bit earlier than usual that morning. I didn't have any real reason, just couldn't sleep, so I figured I'd get a head start on things. It was quiet when I walked into the office, which wasn't all that surprising. I was used to the sound of buzzing fluorescent lights and the hum of the AC, but it was still a little eerie when the place was empty. The first thing I noticed was that Ben's desk was empty. He was always there early. Not like super early, but he usually beat me by at least 10 minutes. Ben wasn't one of those people who would randomly take a day off without telling anyone, and if he had called in sick, I would have known. He wasn't one to slack off either. I sat down at my desk, logging into my computer, and glanced over at his chair again. It was still empty. His computer was off, and his chair was pushed in neatly. I thought it was odd, but maybe he had car trouble or something. I didn't think much of it at first. A little while later, my phone buzzed on my desk. It was a text from Ben. "Hey, are you at work yet?" I smiled, figuring he was probably running late. I texted him back, "Yeah, just got here." "Where are you?" A few seconds passed, and my phone buzzed again. "I need help. Please." I blinked at the screen. That was weird. Ben wasn't the type to joke around, and he definitely didn't send texts like that unless something was wrong. I started typing back, but before I could hit send, another text came through. "They're following me." Now my heart started racing a bit. I glanced around the office. Still empty. I stood up from my chair, pacing a little as I typed. "What's going on? Who's following you?" The 3 dots popped up like he was typing, but then nothing. A few minutes passed, and I was getting more and more anxious. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. No answer. I sat back down, staring at my phone, hoping he'd text again and say it was some kind of misunderstanding. But then, my phone buzzed one more time. "Don't call. Just listen. Please." That was it. Just those words. I felt a chill run down my spine. This didn't feel like a prank or anything, and Ben wasn't someone to mess with people like this. I called him again, despite what the text said. I needed to know what was going on. The phone rang for a few seconds, and then someone picked up. But it wasn't Ben. The voice on the other end was low, slow. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman at first. They just said, "You shouldn't have called." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who is this? Where's Ben? There was a pause on the other end, just the sound of breathing. Then they hung up. I stared at my phone, my hand trembling. That voice, it was flat, emotionless. It wasn't Ben. I didn't know what was happening, but it felt wrong. I stood up and looked around the office again. Still empty. My stomach was in knots, and I didn't know what to do. I tried calling Ben again, but this time it didn't even ring. Straight to voicemail. I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed my bag, hurried out of the office, and headed for the parking lot. I had to figure out what was going on. Maybe I was overreacting, but something about those texts and that voice, it didn't sit right with me. When I got to my car, I sat there for a minute, debating whether to call the police. But what would I say? My coworker sent me a weird text and now some stranger answered his phone? It didn't sound like enough to raise alarms, at least not yet. As I sat there, another text came through. This one was from Ben's phone, but the message didn't feel like it was from him. "Stop looking for him. It's too late." That's when I panicked. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. I called the police. I explained everything, how Ben hadn't shown up to work, the strange texts, the call from the stranger. The dispatcher told me to stay put, that they'd send someone to the office to check things out. I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel, watching the entrance to the building. My heart was racing, and every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. But there were no more messages, just dead silence from Ben's phone. It took the police about 20 minutes to get there. They asked me a bunch of questions, and I showed them the texts and explained the phone call. They told me they'd try to trace the number and see if they could find out what was going on. I waited in the parking lot while they went into the building to look around. After what felt like forever, they came back and told me they couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. Ben's desk was just like I'd seen it, empty, no signs of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. One of the officers asked if I knew where Ben lived, and I gave them his address. They said they'd check it out and let me know if they found anything, but they told me to go home for now. There wasn't much else I could do. I drove home, my mind racing the whole way. Who had answered Ben's phone? What did they mean by "it's too late"? None of it made sense. Later that day, the police called me back. They said they'd gone to Ben's apartment, but he wasn't there. His car was gone, and there were no signs of foul play. They said they put out a missing persons report, but they didn't sound too hopeful. People go missing all the time, they told me. Sometimes they just leave without telling anyone. But I knew Ben. He wouldn't just disappear like that. The next few days were a blur. I kept checking my phone, hoping for more texts or some kind of clue, but there was nothing. The police didn't have any leads, and Ben's phone was still disconnected. Then, about a week later, I got one last text. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. Don't come looking for him again. I don't know who sent it. I don't know what happened to Ben. But I haven't gone back to the office since, and I never will. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I'd taken time off work, packed everything I needed, and finally hit the trail on a Friday morning. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me, the mountains, and some peace and quiet. I needed the break to get away from all the noise of life back home. The trail was quiet, just like I wanted. Not many people were out this time of year. It was early fall, the kind of season where it's cold at night but warm enough during the day to make the hike pleasant. I wasn't in a rush, so I took my time, enjoying the scenery and the quiet that came with being alone. Around mid-afternoon, I spotted a campsite up ahead, tucked off the main trail. It looked like a group had set up camp, but there was something off about it. I couldn't see any people, no one moving around, no voices, no campfire smoke. Just a couple of tents and some gear scattered around. I figured they might have gone for a hike or something, but the whole thing felt abandoned. I walked closer, thinking I'd say hello if anyone was there, but as I approached, I realized just how strange it was. Everything was still there: backpacks, sleeping bags, even food left out on a little foldable table. But there was no sign of the campers. The fire pit was cold, like it hadn't been used in a day or two. A couple of chairs were knocked over, and one of the tents had its flap open, but the inside looked untouched. I called out, "Hello?" just to see if anyone would answer, but nothing. Not even an echo from the trees. It felt wrong, like walking into someone's house when they weren't expecting you. But I couldn't just leave without making sure. Maybe something had happened. Maybe they got lost or hurt. So I took a quick look around. There wasn't much to see. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the site, no personal items left behind that might explain where they'd gone. I stood there for a minute, just staring at the camp. It felt like I shouldn't be there, like I was intruding. But the more I thought about it, the more curious I got. Where would a group of people go, leaving all their gear behind? If they'd gone for a hike, they would have taken at least some supplies with them, right? I decided to set up my own camp nearby, just up the trail, but not too close. I didn't want to mess with their stuff or make it look like I was trying to steal anything. I figured I'd keep an ear out, and maybe they'd come back later. If they didn't, well, I'd deal with it in the morning. Maybe report it to the rangers or something. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful. I set up my tent, cooked some dinner on my little camp stove, and sat back, watching the sun go down behind the mountains. It got cold fast once the sun dipped, and I threw on an extra layer, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been. But I couldn't stop thinking about that abandoned camp. I kept glancing over in its direction, expecting to see someone coming back or hear voices calling out. But there was nothing. The wind picked up a little, making the trees creak and groan, but it was the only sound. By the time it got dark, I was starting to feel uneasy. I'm not usually one to scare easily, but something about that empty campsite just didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the kind of nervous you get when you hear a bear or something. It was something deeper, something that crawls under your skin and makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. I decided to turn in early. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the door, and tried to settle in for the night. But sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, every little sound outside making me sit up and listen. The wind was louder now, and every once in a while, I thought I heard something else mixed in with it. Whispering. Soft, distant, like people talking just out of earshot. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't just the wind. It was voices, several of them, all murmuring together. I couldn't make out any words, but it was enough to make my heart race. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to move, shifting from one side of the tent to the other, like they were circling me. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I scanned the trees outside, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadows. Just the same empty forest I'd seen earlier. But the whispers didn't stop. I unzipped the tent slowly, stepping out into the cold night air. The whispering was clearer now, but still distant, like it was coming from somewhere just out of reach. I turned in the direction of the other campsite, and my stomach dropped. The tents were still there, but they looked different. One of them had collapsed, like it had been stomped down or torn apart. The chairs were knocked over, and the table had been flipped onto its side. It looked like someone had trashed the place, but there were still no people, no sign of anyone. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, listening to the wind. The whispers were louder now, but I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. It was like they were all around me, echoing through the trees. Then, I saw it. Footprints. Fresh ones, leading from the abandoned camp toward the woods. They weren't there earlier, I was sure of it. I crouched down to look closer. They were too big to be from a deer or any animal. These were human footprints, heading deeper into the forest. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to pack up and get out of there, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at those footprints disappearing into the trees. That's when I heard the crunch of leaves behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the woods. Nothing. No movement, no figures. Just trees, swaying in the wind. But I knew what I heard. Someone or something was out there. I backed up to my tent, heart pounding in my chest. I was ready to grab my gear and make a run for it when I heard the voices again. This time, they were louder, closer. Not whispers anymore. It sounded like people arguing. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a sense of urgency, like they were angry or upset. I grabbed my backpack, threw it over my shoulder, and turned to leave. I wasn't staying there another minute. But as I took a step toward the trail, the voices stopped. Silence. And then, footsteps. Coming from the direction of the abandoned camp. I bolted. I didn't care what was going on anymore, I just needed to get out of there. I ran down the trail, not even bothering to look back. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my boots hitting the dirt and the pounding of my own heartbeat. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead hours later. By then, the sun was starting to rise, and the whispers had long faded into the wind. I never found out what happened to the campers. When I told the rangers, they went to check the site, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no gear, no signs of anyone ever being there. I don't know what I heard that night. I don't know who or what was out there. We were in the middle of the desert, just a group of friends on a trip to get away for a few days. There wasn't much out there except miles of dry, cracked ground and mountains that seemed to go on forever. We weren't the type to hit up tourist spots or do normal things. We wanted to explore, to find something different. That's how we stumbled on the bunker. It was an old, concrete building, mostly buried in the sand. We were hiking, looking for nothing in particular when we saw it off in the distance. The door was heavy, metal, and rusted in some places, but not as old as the rest of the place looked. It was cracked open, just enough to catch our attention. "Hey, we gotta check this out," Marcus said. He was always the one pushing us to do stuff like this. He'd find abandoned buildings, old mines, or ghost towns and drag us along. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it sometimes. But something about that bunker didn't sit right with me from the start. Still, we all went in. There were 5 of us, me, Marcus, Jen, Brian, and Kara. We had flashlights, phones, and water, but not much else. The inside was cold, way colder than it should have been for a desert. The air was stale, and the walls were damp, even though we hadn't seen rain for days. It looked like no one had been there for years, except for the footprints. They were faint, but fresh. You could see where the dust had been kicked up in patches, like someone had walked through not too long ago. "Someone's been here," Jen muttered, her voice echoing in the concrete space. "Probably just a hiker or something," Marcus said, brushing it off. "Let's see what's down here." The bunker wasn't big, but it was deep. There were a few narrow corridors that led to smaller rooms. The deeper we went, the darker it got. The walls were lined with pipes, and there was old wiring hanging from the ceiling in places. Some rooms were empty, just concrete and rusted metal. But one room, near the back, had signs of life. A sleeping bag was rolled out on the floor, and there were food wrappers scattered around. It wasn't much, just a can of beans, some energy bars, and a few bottles of water. There was even a small camping stove tucked in the corner. "Looks like someone's been living here," Carol whispered. Her voice was tight, like she didn't want to be heard. "Probably just some drifter," Marcus said again, but this time his voice wasn't as confident. He looked around, shining his flashlight into the corners like he was expecting someone to jump out. We all stood there for a second, not sure what to do next. It didn't feel right to be there, like we were trespassing, even though no one was around. Brian, who had been quiet the whole time, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should go. This place feels off." For once, I agreed with him. But Marcus wasn't ready to leave yet. He wanted to check out the other rooms first. He started walking down another hallway before any of us could stop him. Jen and Kara followed him, and I stayed back with Brian. "I don't like this," Brian muttered, shaking his head. "Me neither," I said, glancing around. The air was getting heavier, like the walls were closing in. Suddenly, we heard the sound of metal scraping. It echoed through the bunker, and Brian and I both froze. The sound came from the direction Marcus had gone, sharp and loud like a door being dragged shut. We exchanged a quick glance before running down the hallway, our footsteps pounding on the concrete. "Marcus?" I called out, but there was no answer. As we turned the corner, we saw the source of the noise. One of the heavy metal doors that had been propped open when we first arrived was now closed. And Marcus, Jen, and Carol were on the other side of it. Brian rushed up to the door and tried pulling it open, but it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he muttered, tugging harder. I pushed on the door, too, but it felt like something was wedged against it from the other side. "Marcus. Jen. Kara." I shouted, banging on the door. Still, no response. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the cold metal, and for a second, I thought I heard something, whispers, maybe, or footsteps. But it was faint, and I couldn't tell if it was just the sound of the wind from outside. "They've got to be messing with us," Brian said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. He kept yanking at the door, more desperate now, as the realization set in that something wasn't right. Suddenly, from deeper inside the bunker, we heard another loud slam. This time it came from behind us, down the corridor we had just come from. Brian's face went pale, and I felt my stomach drop. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The entrance we had come through, the heavy rusted door, was now shut. We hadn't touched it. "Okay, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian didn't argue. We turned and started heading toward the front of the bunker, moving fast but careful. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was watching us, but all I saw was the narrow hallway stretching behind us, lit only by the narrow beams of our flashlights. We reached the main room, the one with the sleeping bag and food wrappers. It looked exactly the same as when we first found it, but now it felt even more sinister. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding, watching us from just out of sight. "Let's try the door," Brian said, hurrying over to the entrance. He gripped the handle and pulled, but it didn't move. He pushed, harder this time, but nothing. "It's stuck." "What the hell?" His voice cracked with panic, and I rushed over to help him. The door didn't budge. No matter how hard we pushed or pulled, it wouldn't move an inch. It was like someone had locked us in. "We need to find another way out," I said, my breath coming faster now. I was trying to stay calm, but every instinct in me was screaming that we were in serious danger. Brian nodded, his face pale, and we turned back into the bunker. There had to be another exit, right? Places like this always had more than one way in and out. We just had to find it. As we made our way deeper into the bunker again, I noticed something that made my heart race even faster: the air. It had changed. It smelled different, like sweat and damp fabric. Like someone had been in there recently. We walked down another corridor, this one narrower, our footsteps echoing in the tight space. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, checking for more footprints, but the dust seemed undisturbed. That didn't mean much, though. Whoever was in here knew the place better than we did. Just as we were about to turn another corner, we heard a sound like metal scraping again, this time from the room we just passed. Brian stopped dead in his tracks, and I felt my stomach twist into a knot. Slowly, I turned my head toward the doorway we had just walked by. My flashlight beam was shaky, but I couldn't see anything. I swallowed hard and took a step forward, but Brian grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Don't," he whispered. "Someone's in here." I didn't argue. We turned and kept moving, faster now. We needed to get out before whoever or whatever was playing this game decided to make their move. But no matter how many corridors we went down, no matter how many doors we checked, we couldn't find another way out. Every exit we tried was either blocked or locked. It was like the bunker was a maze, shifting and trapping us inside. Then, as we reached another dead end, the lights went out. It was sudden, total darkness. My flashlight flickered, but the batteries were running low, and the light barely cut through the blackness. I could hear Brian's breathing, fast and panicked, right next to me. "We have to get out," he whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. We turned and started making our way back the way we had come, trying to retrace our steps. But the more we walked, the less familiar everything seemed. The walls felt closer, the corridors narrower. Suddenly, we heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls. They were behind us, then ahead of us, then all around. We couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. "We need to run," I said, my voice barely steady. Brian nodded, and we took off, sprinting down the hallway. The footsteps followed us, closer now, faster. We burst into the main room again, the one with the sleeping bag, and stopped dead in our tracks. The room was empty. Completely empty. The sleeping bag, the food wrappers, the stove, it was all gone. Like it had never been there in the first place. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. Brian was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "This isn't right," he muttered. "This place, it's not right." Before I could respond, the door behind us slammed shut. We spun around, but no one was there. Just the sound of the metal door echoing through the bunker. We were trapped. The footsteps started again, this time louder, closer. Whoever had been toying with us was done playing. I didn't know what else to do. There was no way out, no way to fight back. So I grabbed Brian's arm, and we backed into the farthest corner of the room, our flashlights flickering, waiting for whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. There was a long, heavy silence, and then the handle started to turn. I don't know what happened after that. I must have blacked out or something, because the next thing I remember, I was outside. The sun was just coming up, and I was lying on the ground, staring up at the sky. Brian was next to me, unconscious but breathing. I don't know how we got out. The bunker was gone, just a pile of sand where it had been the day before. We never spoke about it after that. We just packed up and left, and none of us ever mentioned the bunker again. It was a late night, later than I had planned to be out. The kind of night where the streets are empty and quiet, with just the hum of distant traffic and the occasional flicker from the old streetlights. I had stayed at a friend's place longer than expected. We had been watching some show, drinking beers, and before I knew it, it was past midnight. I live about a mile away, so I figured I'd just walk home. It was a cool night, and the fresh air would do me good after the drinks. I was about halfway home when I first noticed the van. It was just a glance at first, nothing more. It wasn't out of place or anything, just a dark, unmarked van creeping down the street, maybe a block behind me. I didn't think much of it then, figured it was someone just trying to find a parking spot. It was late, after all, and the city's known for tight parking. I turned onto a side street, one of those smaller, less lit roads that cut through the neighborhood, and as I walked, I heard the low rumble of the van's engine. It was faint but unmistakable, the kind of noise that's just there in the background, sticking with you even when you're trying not to notice. It was still behind me, creeping along at the same pace I was walking. I told myself it was nothing. Lots of people drive slow at night, especially in neighborhoods like this. But something about it just felt off. The van wasn't passing me. It wasn't speeding up or slowing down. It was just there, behind me, matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. The van was about 30 feet back, moving steady. No headlights, just the dim glow of the streetlights reflecting off the dark windows. I couldn't see inside, and that bothered me more than anything. There were no logos, no decals, just a plain, dark van, crawling behind me in the night. I picked up my pace a little, not wanting to seem paranoid but wanting to put some distance between me and it. My heart started beating a little faster, and I shoved my hands deeper into my jacket pockets. The van sped up too. Not by much, but just enough that it stayed right behind me, maybe 20 feet back now. Close enough that I could hear the tires crunching against the pavement the engine still rumbling low. That's when I started to panic. It wasn't normal. This wasn't just some guy driving around. I could feel it. They were following me. I didn't want to break into a run that would be too obvious, too desperate. But I wasn't far from home now, just a couple more blocks, and I was starting to consider it. I turned another corner, a sharp right onto a slightly busier street, hoping maybe the van would lose interest, or at least I'd run into someone else, another person, anyone. But the street was just as empty as the last one. The van followed, of course. This time, though, it sped up. It was maybe 10 feet behind me now, creeping closer and closer. I could hear it. Not just the van, but something else. Like voices. Muffled, low, coming from inside. It was hard to tell, but I was sure of it. And then the van slowed again, rolling to a stop just ahead of me, a little too close for comfort. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, and a man leaned out. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. There was another guy in the passenger seat, but I couldn't get a good look at him. He stayed in the shadows. "Hey, buddy," the driver called out, his voice smooth, like he was trying to be friendly. "You need a ride?" I didn't say anything at first. I just shook my head and started to walk again, stepping off the curb to cross the street, away from the van. But the driver kept talking. "Come on, man, it's late. We'll give you a lift. It's no trouble." I shook my head again, quicker this time, and kept walking, my eyes straight ahead. I didn't want to engage. I just wanted to get home. But I couldn't ignore the van. I could hear it, the door sliding open behind me, footsteps hitting the pavement. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the man said again, his voice sharper now, losing the fake friendliness. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see them. I just picked up my pace, almost jogging now. The footsteps followed. They were getting closer. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I could run, but where? There was nowhere to go. No one was out here. I didn't even know if I could make it home before they caught up to me. Suddenly, I heard a thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the passenger had gotten out of the van. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he was holding something, a bat or a pipe. I couldn't tell. That was it. I ran. I sprinted down the street, my shoes slapping against the pavement, my breath coming in sharp bursts. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding against the ground, the van's engine roaring to life again as it started to follow me. They weren't going to let me go. I turned down an alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of side streets. The alley was narrow, with dumpsters and broken-down cars lining the sides, but it was dark enough that I might have a chance. I heard the van's tires screech as they sped around the corner, the engine roaring as it got closer. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw a small gap between two buildings, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Without thinking, I dove into it, pressing myself against the cold brick wall, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The van roared past the alley, the men still shouting to each other, their voices echoing through the empty streets. I waited, not daring to move, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded. The van was gone. I stayed hidden for a while longer, just to be sure. When I finally emerged, the streets were quiet again. There was no sign of the van, no sign of the men. I made it home that night, but I'll never forget the sound of that van creeping up behind me, or the look in the driver's eyes when he offered me that ride. I don't know what would have happened if I had gotten in, and I don't want to know. I went to this music festival in the desert, something I had been looking forward to for months. I'm not the kind of person who usually does this kind of thing, but my friends convinced me it would be fun, so I bought a ticket. The festival was loud, packed, and intense, with lights and music everywhere, which was cool for a while, but I needed a break. It was mid-afternoon, the sun still hanging high, though it wasn't as blistering as earlier. The crowd had spread out more by that time, and I figured I could slip away for a bit. There were little trails and paths behind the festival grounds, leading into the desert hills. I just wanted some space, some quiet, even if just for a few minutes. I started walking along one of those paths, not really going anywhere in particular. The festival sounds faded behind me, replaced by this eerie desert stillness. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, even though I could still hear the faint thump of the bass in the distance. I didn't plan on going too far, maybe just around the next bend, but as I walked, I noticed a guy coming up the trail in the opposite direction. He looked like he was coming from deeper in the desert, away from the festival, and at first, I didn't think much of it. He looked normal enough, mid-30s, wearing a tank top and sunglasses, kind of scruffy like a lot of people out here. But as we got closer, he slowed down and stared at me, which threw me off. I wasn't used to strangers paying that much attention. I didn't want to seem rude, so I smiled a little and nodded, just a quick hey as we passed each other, but he stopped. "You headed out there?" he asked, pointing further down the trail. No, just stretching my legs," I said, thinking that would be enough to end the conversation. "There's this cool spot a little further out," he continued, his voice low and casual, like he wasn't really asking. "It's a hidden place not many people know about. Thought you might want to check it out." I shook my head and smiled again, trying to keep it polite. "I'm good, thanks. Just needed some air." He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me for a moment too long. Then he said, "It's not far. I can show you." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it, like he already expected me to go with him, like I didn't really have a choice. "I really should get back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, turning to head back toward the festival. But he stepped in front of me, blocking the way. "Come on," he said, more insistent now. "It's just down the trail." I froze. My stomach dropped. This was wrong, and I knew it. The way he was looking at me, like he was daring me to refuse again. "No," I said, louder this time, stepping back, trying to make it clear that I wasn't interested, that I wanted to go back. But he stepped toward me again, closing the gap I had made. His whole demeanor shifted in that moment, from casual to something else, something darker. I said, "I'll show you. It's not a big deal." My heart was racing now, panic building in my chest. I didn't want to be out here anymore, alone with this guy. I glanced around, but the trail was empty. There was no one else out here, no one to see this, no one to help. "I need to go," I said, my voice shaky now, taking another step back. He reached out, grabbing my arm just a little, just enough to stop me from moving any further. His grip wasn't tight, not yet, but it was firm enough that I knew he wasn't letting go easily. "Don't be like that," he said, his voice low and threatening now. "Just come check it out." I yanked my arm away, hard, stumbling back a few steps. I was shaking now, terrified, but I couldn't let him see that. I turned and started walking fast back toward the festival, trying to keep calm, to not break into a full run. But I could hear him behind me, his footsteps following, quickening to match mine. "Hey," he shouted after me, his voice sharp. "I'm talking to you." I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, faster and faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still hear him behind me, getting closer. I couldn't tell if he was walking or running, but I knew he wasn't giving up. I broke into a run, finally. I didn't care anymore if I looked scared. I was scared. I just wanted to get away from him, to get back to the crowd, back to safety. The festival wasn't that far, just over the next hill. If I could make it there, I'd be okay. But he was running too, his footsteps heavy and fast behind me. I could hear him getting closer, his breath ragged, like he was getting angry. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I wasn't used to running like this, but adrenaline was keeping me going. I could see the tops of the tents now, hear the music again, louder, closer. I was almost there. Then I heard him yell, "Stop. Just stop." His voice was desperate now, frustrated. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I sprinted the last few yards, bursting back into the festival grounds, weaving through the crowd. My chest was heaving, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to come after me, to grab me, drag me away in front of everyone. But he wasn't there. He hadn't followed me into the crowd. I kept moving, putting as much distance between me and the edge of the festival as I could, blending into the mass of people. My heart was still racing, my skin prickling with fear, but I knew I was safe now. I didn't see him again after that. I don't know if he went back into the desert or if he just disappeared into the crowd. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me for longer than I realized, that he had been waiting for the right moment to approach, to lure me away from everyone else. I spent the rest of the festival close to my friends, making sure I was never alone again. But even surrounded by people, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting, watching. I was out late, more than I intended. I had gone to a friend's birthday party and ended up staying longer than planned. It was past midnight by the time I decided to call a ride and head home. The place was pretty far from where I lived, so I wasn't keen on trying to find a cab myself. I opened my rideshare app, and it only took a few minutes for a car to pull up. It was a black sedan, which matched the description of the car in the app. The driver was a middle-aged man with a beard and glasses. He greeted me politely as I climbed in, and I told him my address. We drove out of the city, and everything seemed normal for a while. But then, I started to notice that we were heading in a direction that didn't quite match the route I was used to. I checked my phone and saw that the app was still tracking us, but the map seemed off. We were getting further from my neighborhood and closer to a part of town I didn't recognize. I was trying to stay calm, telling myself maybe the app was just glitching or the driver was taking a different route. But as the minutes ticked by, the realization that something was wrong began to settle in. I tried to discreetly check the driver's details again on the app, but the screen showed that the trip had ended. The driver hadn't canceled. It was as if the app had just lost connection. I decided to confront him. "Excuse me, but the route seems different from what I expected. Could you double-check the address?" He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting mine briefly. "We're almost there. It's just a different route to avoid traffic." The way he said it didn't sound right. It was too rehearsed, too calm. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. I tried to call the rideshare support line, but there was no signal. We were in a more rural area now, and the phone service was spotty. My heart started racing. I needed to get out of the car. I looked around, trying to figure out where we were. The houses were sparse, and the street lights were few and far between. There was no obvious place to escape to if I needed to get out quickly. I pretended to relax, trying to think of a plan. I noticed that the doors were locked, and I couldn't open them from the inside. The windows were only slightly cracked. If I tried to open the door while the car was moving, there was a risk of drawing attention, and I didn't want to make any sudden moves that might make things worse. The car slowed down as we approached a long, gravel driveway leading to a dark house in the distance. My stomach sank. This was definitely not my address. I had to act fast. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I really need to use the restroom. Can we stop for a moment? The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror again. We're almost there. It won't be long. I knew I had to try something else. As the car stopped at the end of the driveway, I pretended to be distracted by something on my phone, hoping to buy some time. I carefully unbuckled my seatbelt and waited for the right moment. When the car came to a halt and the driver shifted in his seat, I saw my chance. I unlocked the door, opened it slightly, and looked for a way to escape. The gravel under the car was loud, so I knew I had to move quickly. I slipped out of the car, careful not to make a sound. I darted toward the nearby bushes, hoping to stay hidden. I could hear the driver calling out to me, his voice growing more frantic as I disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop to look back, I just kept running. I finally reached a road with more lights and cars. I flagged down a passing vehicle, and thankfully, the driver was kind enough to help me. I gave them my address and waited anxiously as we drove back toward the city. My heart was still pounding, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that black sedan following us. When I finally got home, I called the police and reported the incident. They took down my information and said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything further. I was safe, but the whole experience left me shaken. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Always double-check the details of your ride, and if something doesn't feel right, don't hesitate to get out and seek help. I'm grateful I managed to escape, but I'll never forget that night. I had taken my 2 dogs, Max and Bella, for what I thought would be a peaceful hike in the national forest near our home. It was a crisp, clear morning, perfect for a day out in the woods. We were about an hour in, and the dogs were happily trotting ahead of me, sniffing around as they usually do. We stopped by a small clearing for a water break, and that's when I noticed they were gone. At first, I thought they might have wandered off a bit further, so I called out to them. No response. I walked a little ways down the trail, calling their names louder, but still nothing. I tried not to panic. It's easy for dogs to get distracted, especially in a place as rich with smells as the forest. I started backtracking, thinking they might have gone the other way. After another hour of searching and calling, I began to get worried. There were no signs of them, no paw prints, no sound. It was as if they had just vanished. At this point, I was starting to get desperate. I knew I couldn't cover the whole forest on my own, so I decided to head back to the main trail and look for help. That's when I saw him, another hiker coming toward me. He was wearing a dark green jacket and a hat that shadowed his face. I could tell he had been out here for a while. I approached him, trying to stay calm. "Excuse me, have you seen 2 dogs around here? They're missing, and I've been searching for them for hours. He looked at me with a sort of guarded curiosity. No, I haven't seen any dogs. What kind were they? I told him they were a German Shepherd and a Labrador. He nodded, but his expression was hard to read. There was something about his demeanor that struck me as off, like he was hiding something. I've been out here for a while, he said. There's a spot further up the trail where people sometimes camp. Maybe they went that way. I thanked him and decided to check out the spot he mentioned. It was a bit of a detour from the main trail, but I was willing to try anything at this point. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. When I reached the camping spot, I found it deserted but looked recently used. There were signs of a campfire, some discarded food wrappers, and even a broken leash. My heart sank. The leash looked like it might have belonged to Max. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was about to turn around and head back when I heard a rustling noise behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. I took a deep breath and started making my way back to the main trail. That's when I saw the same hiker again, standing at the edge of the trail, watching me. "Did you find anything?" he asked, his voice oddly calm. I told him about the campfire and the leash. He didn't say much, just nodded and said, "Maybe you should check with the park rangers. They might know if there have been any recent reports of missing pets." I agreed, although I was unsure if that was good advice or if he was just trying to get rid of me. I hurried back to the trailhead and reported everything to the park rangers. They took my information and promised to help search. They found Max and Bella later that evening. They were safe but obviously shaken. They had been found near the area where I had seen the hiker. The rangers didn't mention anything about the other hiker, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I never saw that man again, and I never found out what he knew or if he had anything to do with the disappearance of my dogs. But the encounter left me feeling uneasy. I'm just grateful that Max and Bella are back home with me and safe. It started about a month ago, on a Saturday morning. I found a small package on my doorstep when I went out to get the mail. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no note or return address. Inside was a neatly folded scarf. I didn't recognize it, but it was nice, so I figured it might have been a mistake or a gift from a friend. The next week, another package appeared. This time, it was a box of high-end chocolates. Still no note or explanation. I was a little puzzled but thought maybe someone was trying to be kind. The third week, there was a handwritten letter along with a pair of expensive sunglasses. The letter was just a short, polite note saying, "I hope you enjoy these. From your neighbor." That's when I started feeling uneasy. I had never met this neighbor. I lived in a small apartment building, and I knew most of the people who lived there, but not this one. I decided to ask around and see if anyone knew who it might be. No one seemed to know. The gifts continued, and they started getting more personal. There was a picture frame with a photo of a sunset that looked like it had been taken from the view outside my apartment. Then a journal with my initials on it, even though I had never mentioned them to anyone. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just someone who had gone a little overboard with kindness. But then it took a turn. One day, I received a box with a pair of shoes that I had been eyeing in the store. They were the exact size and style I wanted. I hadn't mentioned them to anyone. That same week, I got a package with a locket that had a photo of me inside. It was a photo taken from a distance, one I didn't even know had been taken. I was starting to get really scared. I decided to confront the neighbor. I went to the apartment where the gifts had been coming from. It was a door on the third floor, at the end of the hall. I knocked, and after a moment, a man in his mid-30s opened the door. He looked like a regular guy, but there was something off about him. "Hi," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been receiving gifts from your apartment." I'm a bit confused and worried. He looked at me blankly. "Gifts? I don't know what you're talking about." I showed him the locket, the picture frame, and other items. "These are from your place. Do you know anything about them?" He shook his head. "No, I haven't sent you anything. Maybe it's someone else in the building?" I didn't believe him. I could see a slight unease in his eyes, but he continued to deny everything. I was getting anxious, so I said I would report it to the building management and the police if it continued. I left his apartment feeling unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what he had said and wondering if I should call the police right away. I decided to wait and see if anything else happened. The next morning, I found another package. It was a photo album filled with pictures of me, my apartment building, and even some of me out in public. I felt a wave of terror. This was beyond creepy. I called the police and reported everything, showing them the items and explaining the situation. The police investigated but didn't find anything unusual in his apartment. They said they'd keep an eye on him, but without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I started getting nervous about staying in my apartment. I was always on edge, worried about who might be watching me. Eventually, the gifts stopped. I don't know why or if the neighbor had been warned or if he had just moved on. I started feeling a bit safer, but the whole experience left me deeply shaken. I still live in the same apartment, but I'm always careful about who I trust and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. I rented a room in an old house about 6 months ago. The place was cheap, and the landlord seemed decent enough. There was one thing, though, that always bugged me: the basement door. It was locked with a heavy padlock, and no one seemed to have the key. I tried not to think too much about it, but my curiosity always got the better of me. A few weeks ago, the landlord went out of town for a week. He told me I could call him if there were any issues, but other than that, he'd be out of reach. I remember feeling a bit of excitement when he left. I'd always wondered what was down in that basement. I decided that this was the perfect chance to find out. I waited until the house was quiet. My heart was pounding as I walked down the stairs to the basement. The padlock was as old as the door, rusty and heavy. I took a deep breath and managed to pry it open with a wrench I found in the garage. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The basement was dark, lit only by the faint light coming from a small window high up near the ceiling. I stumbled around in the dim light, trying to get my bearings. The basement was filled with old furniture, boxes, and dusty tools. It seemed like it hadn't been touched in years. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. There was a large, covered object in the corner, obscured by old sheets. My curiosity took over, and I pulled off the sheet. What I saw made my blood run cold. Underneath was a table with straps and restraints attached to it. There were also old medical tools laid out neatly on a shelf nearby: surgical instruments, syringes, and vials of something dark and unidentifiable. My heart was racing. This wasn't just old junk, it looked like something out of a horror movie. I noticed a metal door at the far end of the basement, half hidden behind a stack of crates. It was slightly ajar. I approached it cautiously and pushed it open. Inside was a small room with more disturbing items. There were old photos pinned to the wall. They were blurry and yellowed, but the faces in them were clear enough to make me shiver. They were pictures of people who looked scared, tied up in various states of distress. On a small desk in the corner, I found a journal. It was filled with detailed notes and entries about various experiments and patients. As I read through the journal, it became evident that the previous tenant of the house was involved in some kind of twisted activities. There were mentions of people being brought to the house and not leaving, and of procedures conducted in the basement. My stomach turned as I realized what I had stumbled upon. I had to get out of there. I quickly left the basement, locked the door behind me, and made sure everything looked untouched. I knew I had to report this, but I needed to be careful. When the landlord came back, I was a bundle of nerves. I told him I found the basement door unlocked and had just looked around, but I didn't mention what I saw. I wanted to keep myself safe and avoid any confrontation that might put me in danger. A few days later, I contacted the authorities anonymously. I gave them a tip about the basement, hoping they would investigate. I didn't want to be involved directly, but I couldn't just leave it as it was. I never heard what happened after that, but I moved out shortly after and never looked back. To this day, I still get uneasy thinking about that basement. I never imagined I'd find something so horrifying just by being curious. I'm just glad I got out of there before anything else happened. I rented a room in an old house about 6 months ago. The place was cheap, and the landlord seemed decent enough. There was one thing, though, that always bugged me: the basement door. It was locked with a heavy padlock, and no one seemed to have the key. I tried not to think too much about it, but my curiosity always got the better of me. A few weeks ago, the landlord went out of town for a week. He told me I could call him if there were any issues, but other than that, he'd be out of reach. I remember feeling a bit of excitement when he left. I'd always wondered what was down in that basement. I decided that this was the perfect chance to find out. I waited until the house was quiet. My heart was pounding as I walked down the stairs to the basement. The padlock was as old as the door, rusty and heavy. I took a deep breath and managed to pry it open with a wrench I found in the garage. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The basement was dark, lit only by the faint light coming from a small window high up near the ceiling. I stumbled around in the dim light, trying to get my bearings. The basement was filled with old furniture, boxes, and dusty tools. It seemed like it hadn't been touched in years. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. There was a large, covered object in the corner, obscured by old sheets. My curiosity took over, and I pulled off the sheet. What I saw made my blood run cold. Underneath was a table with straps and restraints attached to it. There were also old medical tools laid out neatly on a shelf nearby: surgical instruments, syringes, and vials of something dark and unidentifiable. My heart was racing. This wasn't just old junk, it looked like something out of a horror movie. I noticed a metal door at the far end of the basement, half hidden behind a stack of crates. It was slightly ajar. I approached it cautiously and pushed it open. Inside was a small room with more disturbing items. There were old photos pinned to the wall. They were blurry and yellowed, but the faces in them were clear enough to make me shiver. They were pictures of people who looked scared, tied up in various states of distress. On a small desk in the corner, I found a journal. It was filled with detailed notes and entries about various experiments and patients. As I read through the journal, it became evident that the previous tenant of the house was involved in some kind of twisted activities. There were mentions of people being brought to the house and not leaving, and of procedures conducted in the basement. My stomach turned as I realized what I had stumbled upon. I had to get out of there. I quickly left the basement, locked the door behind me, and made sure everything looked untouched. I knew I had to report this, but I needed to be careful. When the landlord came back, I was a bundle of nerves. I told him I found the basement door unlocked and had just looked around, but I didn't mention what I saw. I wanted to keep myself safe and avoid any confrontation that might put me in danger. A few days later, I contacted the authorities anonymously. I gave them a tip about the basement, hoping they would investigate. I didn't want to be involved directly, but I couldn't just leave it as it was. I never heard what happened after that, but I moved out shortly after and never looked back. To this day, I still get uneasy thinking about that basement. I never imagined I'd find something so horrifying just by being curious. I'm just glad I got out of there before anything else happened. I was on a business trip and stayed in a hotel I had never been to before. It was a standard place, nothing fancy, but clean and decent enough. I checked in, got my key, and went to my room. The first night went by without incident, but the next morning, something happened that left me shaken. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling. My heart started racing as I realized there was someone in the room. I could barely make out a figure standing by the window. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and saw a man there, just standing still. I was terrified, unable to move or make a sound. The man seemed as startled as I was. He quickly said, "I'm sorry, I must be in the wrong room." He turned and left before I could react. I was frozen for what felt like ages, but eventually, I mustered the courage to check if he was really gone. I didn't see anyone in the hallway, and my door was still locked. When morning came, I was still on edge. I decided to go downstairs and ask about the man, hoping to figure out if there was some mistake or if I was just imagining things. I approached the front desk and described the man. He was tall, with dark hair, and wore a blue shirt. I asked if they had any record of someone like that staying in the hotel. The receptionist looked at me puzzled and said, "We don't have anyone by that description registered here." "Are you sure you didn't just dream it?" I insisted that I was sure, and asked if they could check again. The receptionist made a few calls, but their response was the same. No one fitting the description had checked into the hotel. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I didn't know what to make of it. I asked if anyone had recently moved out or if there had been any staff changes. Nothing out of the ordinary was reported. The hotel staff seemed genuinely puzzled and reassured me that everything was normal. I went back to my room, trying to piece together what had happened. I checked and rechecked my door and window locks, and made sure everything was secure. I was so anxious that I barely slept the rest of my stay. The next day, I decided to leave early and checked out as soon as I could. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept thinking about how easily he had entered and left without anyone noticing. I contacted the hotel management later on, but they assured me again that no record showed any issues. They said they had reviewed the security footage but found nothing out of place. I never found out who that man was or why he was in my room. I still think about that night often. I don't know what he intended or if he was just as confused as I was. All I know is that it was a chilling experience that left me questioning the safety of places where you should feel secure. I was on my way to the cabin I had rented for the weekend, trying to get away from everything. Work had been a mess, life wasn't much better, so a few days in the woods seemed like the perfect break. I'd been driving for hours, feeling the tension ease as the city disappeared behind me. The roads became narrower, trees thicker, and eventually, I was on a dirt path winding through the forest. My GPS was spotty at best, but I had written down the directions, and the rental company had given me a map. I figured I'd be fine. At some point, I must have missed a turn. I'm still not sure when or where, but I remember driving past a fork in the road, the trees closing in a bit more. I thought maybe I was still on the right path because it all looked the same: woods, dirt road, the occasional sign. But after a while, something felt off. I should have reached the cabin by then. I slowed down, looking for landmarks or something familiar, but everything around me seemed strange and unfamiliar. Eventually, I saw a cabin up ahead, tucked back in the trees. I figured maybe I was closer than I thought, so I pulled up, relieved to see the place. The cabin looked just like the pictures I'd seen online, small, wooden, with a porch. I parked the car and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. It wasn't until I was standing in front of the door that I noticed something was wrong. There were people inside. I could hear voices, laughter, and the clatter of dishes. This wasn't my cabin. The place I'd rented was supposed to be empty, just me for the weekend. I was confused. I walked back to my car, thinking I'd better check the directions again, figure out where I went wrong. As I was pulling out the map, the front door creaked open and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with long, graying hair tied back in a loose braid. She wore a simple dress, kind of old-fashioned, like something you'd see in an old movie. She smiled at me, but it didn't feel right. Something about her expression seemed off. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sweet but strange, like she was forcing it to sound friendly. I stammered for a second, feeling awkward. I think I made a wrong turn. I was looking for a cabin I rented." Her smile didn't waver. "You're not lost. Come on in, have some dinner. It's almost ready." I was taken aback by how casually she invited me in, like we were old friends or something. My gut told me to decline, but she was standing there, staring at me expectantly. Before I could think of an excuse, a man appeared behind her in the doorway. He was taller than her, broad-shouldered, and wearing a worn-out flannel shirt. His face was expressionless, eyes fixed on me. "You should stay," he said, his voice deep and steady. "It's getting dark." I glanced at the sky, realizing the sun had dipped lower than I thought. Still, I didn't like the idea of staying with people I didn't know, especially since something about the whole situation felt wrong. But they were both standing there, waiting for me to respond, and it felt strange to refuse. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Just for a few minutes," I said. "Then I'll get back on the road." The woman's smile widened. "Of course. Come in." I followed them inside, instantly feeling a chill as I crossed the threshold. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, with a few old lamps casting a dull yellow light. The place smelled like food, something savory and rich, though I couldn't quite place what it was. There was a small dining table set up with plates, cutlery, and glasses, like they'd been expecting someone. Two other people were already seated at the table, a teenage girl, maybe 16, and a younger boy, around 10. They both looked up at me when I entered, but neither of them said a word. The girl had the same strange smile as the woman, and the boy stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Sit," the man said, pointing to an empty chair. I hesitated for a second before sitting down. The woman disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear her moving around, the sound of pots and pans clanging together. The man sat across from me, still staring without blinking. "What brings you out here?" he asked. "Just needed a break," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Rented a cabin for the weekend, but I must have taken the wrong road." "You're here now," he said, his tone flat. I nodded, not knowing what else to say. The room was quiet except for the occasional clatter from the kitchen. I could feel the girl's eyes on me, though I didn't dare look at her. Something about her made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, the woman returned with a large pot, setting it down in the middle of the table. She ladled something thick and steaming into the bowls in front of us. It smelled strong, almost overpowering, and I felt my stomach turn. I wasn't hungry, but I knew it would be rude not to eat. Go on, the woman urged. Eat up. I picked up the spoon and dipped it into the bowl, hesitating before bringing it to my mouth. The taste was off. It was thick and greasy, and I couldn't tell what kind of meat it was. I forced myself to swallow a few bites, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my gut. The man kept watching me, never touching his own food. The kids ate in silence, their eyes flicking between me and the adults. The woman sat at the head of the table, smiling that same unsettling smile. "So, you're traveling alone?" she asked, her tone casual but with an edge to it. "Yeah," I said, glancing toward the window. The sun was nearly gone, and the sky outside had turned a deep shade of purple. "I should probably get going soon." "Nonsense," the man said. "It's too late to be driving now. You'll stay here tonight." My heart skipped a beat. I really can't. I need to find the cabin I rented. "You're staying," the woman said, her voice a little sharper this time. "It's not safe to be out there after dark." I could feel the tension in the room shift. The air seemed to get heavier, and the man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "You don't want to go out there," he said. "Trust me." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I didn't know how to get out without causing a scene. I stood up, trying to keep my voice steady. "I appreciate the offer, but I really need to get going. Thank you for the meal." The man stood up too, moving faster than I expected. He blocked my path to the door, his expression darkening. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low. Panic surged through me. I backed up, bumping into the table. The woman stood as well, her smile gone now, replaced with a cold, hard stare. The kids remained seated, watching the scene unfold without a word. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "I just need to leave." The man didn't move. He stood there, towering over me, his fists clenched at his sides. I glanced around the room, looking for another way out, but the only door was the one he was blocking. "You're not leaving," the woman repeated, her voice eerily calm. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest chair and shoved it toward the man, trying to create enough space to run. He stumbled back, startled, and I bolted for the door. I yanked it open and sprinted outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back. I could hear them shouting behind me, their voices echoing in the dark, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook. Finally, I got the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw the cabin getting smaller and smaller, the figures of the family standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. My heart was still pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I pulled over, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with what had just happened. I don't know who they were, or what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to get out of there. I woke up in the middle of the night, not really sure what had disturbed me at first. I sat up in bed and listened for a while, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, right on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I live alone in a small house out in the country, so hearing something like that isn't normal. The nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and nobody just comes by this time of night. I lay there for a few seconds, frozen, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal. But animals don't walk like that. They don't take slow, careful steps, like someone trying not to be noticed. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep by the bed and crept toward the front door. The sound had stopped by the time I got close, so I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out. The porch light flickered dimly, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, looking around the yard. Nothing. The grass was still, and the night was silent, too silent. I stood there for a while, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but all I heard was my own heartbeat. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch for a long time, too jittery to go back to bed. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The day passed without incident. I went about my usual routine, trying to forget about what had happened the night before. I convinced myself that maybe it had been a stray dog or something, even though I knew that wasn't true. As night fell again, though, the unease started creeping back in. I didn't sleep much that night, just laid in bed, listening for any noise. And sure enough, sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. It sounded like they were right up against the front door. I sat up in bed, gripping the bat so tightly my hands hurt. I waited, listening to the sound of someone or something pacing back and forth on the porch. The steps were heavier this time, more confident, as if whoever it was knew I was awake and listening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any movement. But there was nothing, just silence again. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to go outside, too afraid to even look out the window. This became a pattern over the next few nights. I'd go to bed, try to sleep, and then, in the dead of night, the footsteps would return. Each time, they got closer, bolder. They lingered longer. Whoever it was never knocked, never tried to get in, just paced outside like they were waiting for something. By the 4th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I was going to confront whoever it was. I stayed up, sitting by the front door with the bat in my lap, waiting. When the footsteps started, I jumped up and threw open the door. There was no one there. The porch was empty, just like before. But I knew I'd heard something. The sound of footsteps had been so clear, right on the other side of the door. My skin crawled. I stepped out onto the porch again, looking around the yard, the woods surrounding the house. It was dark, too dark. The moon barely lit anything, and the shadows seemed to stretch out forever. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a chair up against it. I sat there the rest of the night, not moving, barely blinking. The footsteps didn't come back that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The next day, I called the local sheriff's office. I told them what had been happening, but they didn't seem too concerned. Probably just some kids messing around, they said. They promised to send someone out to patrol the area, but that didn't make me feel any better. That night, I tried to stay calm, tried to tell myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't sleep, not really. I kept listening, waiting for the footsteps to start again. And they did. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the house, slowly, methodically. I could hear them moving from the front door to the windows, stopping just long enough for me to imagine someone standing there, peering in. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to go away. But it didn't. It went on for hours. I don't know how I made it through that night, but when the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, the footsteps finally stopped. I knew I couldn't stay in the house another night. I packed a bag, planning to leave for a few days, let things settle down. But as I loaded up the car, I had the horrible feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. Still, the sensation wouldn't go away. It was like eyes were on me, from the woods, from the shadows, from somewhere I couldn't see. I drove into town and stayed at a motel that night. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to get away, needed to sleep without the sound of footsteps echoing in my ears. But even in the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally returned to the house a few days later, everything seemed normal. No signs of anyone having been there, no footprints on the porch, no damage to the windows or doors. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew better. I could still feel it, that uneasy tension in the air, like someone was just out of sight, watching and waiting. That night, the footsteps came again. They were louder, more deliberate. They stopped right at the front door, and then, for the first time, there was a knock. Just one. Soft, but firm. I didn't move, didn't answer. The knocking came again, this time a little louder, more insistent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I waited, praying it would stop, but the knocking continued. I knew I couldn't open the door, but I also knew I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whoever was on the other side. I crept over to the door, holding my breath, and looked through the peephole. There was nothing. The porch was empty. But the knocking kept coming, steady, deliberate. I backed away from the door, grabbed my car keys, and ran out the back. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, speeding away from the house. I never went back. I couldn't. I had been feeling worn out from work, so I booked a weekend stay at this small, remote farm upstate. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind, no noise, no people, just me and the quiet. The farmhouse was old but cozy, and the farmer who rented it out, Greg, seemed friendly enough when I arrived. He showed me around, explained a bit about the history of the place, and then left me to settle in. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it walking around the fields, sitting by the pond, just soaking in the peace. That night, I made a small fire outside and stared up at the stars for what felt like hours. It was pitch black out there, no streetlights, no passing cars, just pure, quiet darkness. I went to bed feeling relaxed, like I'd made the right choice coming here. The second day, I barely saw Greg. I figured he was off doing farm work, so I just did my own thing again. Around dusk, I noticed him walking back from one of the fields, and he waved me over. When I got close, he looked different. His easygoing attitude from the day before was gone. His smile was tight, forced. I asked him if everything was all right, and he just nodded, said it was nothing, that I should head inside soon. Later that evening, I was getting ready to turn in when I heard the sound of a lock clicking. I went to check and found that the front door was bolted from the outside. I tried the back door, same thing. Panic set in, and I knocked on the windows, calling out for Greg. He didn't answer right away, but eventually, I heard him walking up to the house. I locked up for the night, he said from outside, his voice muffled through the door. Why? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I thought I was supposed to be able to come and go as I please. It's for your safety, he replied, his tone flat. You don't want to be outside after dark around here. I asked him what he meant, but he just repeated that it was for my safety and walked away before I could ask anything else. I stood there, confused, listening to his footsteps fade into the distance. The farm was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, heavy. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, scratches, soft thuds, like something was moving around outside. At first, I thought maybe it was just animals, but the more I listened, the more it started to sound like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the house. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. I kept thinking about Greg's face earlier that evening, the way his smile had seemed wrong, forced. Something wasn't right here. But there was nothing I could do. The doors were locked, and the windows were too small to climb out of. I was trapped. Hours passed, and the noises outside didn't stop. At one point, I heard a low, guttural sound, like something was growling. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before, but it was close. Really close. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, listening, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. At least not until early morning when the first light started creeping through the curtains. That's when the noises finally stopped. The farm felt still again, but the tension in the air was thick, like something had changed. When Craig unlocked the doors that morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He smiled, asked if I slept well, even offered me some breakfast. I asked him about the noises, and he just shrugged, said it was probably the wind or some coyotes. But I didn't believe him. There was something he wasn't telling me, something he was hiding. I tried to keep things normal, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. Craig watched me more closely that day, his eyes following me wherever I went, like he was waiting for me to ask more questions. I wanted to, but every time I tried, he'd just give me that same tight smile and change the subject. That night, just before dark, I heard the lock click again. I rushed to the door, but it was too late. Craig had already bolted it from the outside. I shouted for him, demanded he let me out, but he didn't respond. I pounded on the door until my fists hurt, but he didn't come back. I was locked in again. The noises started earlier this time. As soon as the sun disappeared, I heard them footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the house. I sat in the middle of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed earlier, my eyes darting to every window, every shadow. And then, the growling came back. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't an animal, it couldn't be. The sound was too human. Like someone was trying to mimic the sound of an animal, but failing. I heard something scrape against the wall outside, right next to the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I could see the shadow of someone outside, pacing back and forth. Suddenly, the handle on the back door rattled. I jumped up, gripping the knife tighter. The rattling stopped for a moment, then started again, harder this time, like someone was trying to force the door open. I backed up, my eyes locked on the door, praying it would hold. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. But the footsteps didn't. They moved to the front of the house, then back to the side, like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to find a way in. I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours, but eventually, the noises faded, and everything went quiet again. I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to sleep, waiting for Greg to come back. When he unlocked the doors the next morning, I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my stuff and told him I was leaving. He didn't argue. He didn't try to stop me. He just smiled that same tight smile and said, "You'll be safer if you leave now." I drove away from that farm as fast as I could, and I haven't looked back since. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something was wrong with that place, with Craig, and I'm never going back. I checked into the hotel late, around 10 p.m. I had a work meeting in the morning and needed a good night's sleep. It was one of those generic chain hotels you find off the highway, nothing fancy, just a place to rest. The room they gave me was on the second floor, 213. I remember the hallway being long and kind of dim, even though all the lights were on. It felt weird, but I was exhausted, so I didn't think too much of it. When I got to my room, everything seemed normal. It looked clean enough, smelled a little musty, but that's normal for a hotel room, I guess. I threw my bag down and went straight to the bathroom to wash my face and brush my teeth. I was halfway through getting ready for bed when I heard it. A faint thumping noise, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I figured it was just someone moving around in the room next door. Maybe they were rearranging their luggage or something. But the noise kept going, not loud, but just persistent enough that it started to get on my nerves. I figured it would stop soon, so I got into bed and tried to ignore it. But it didn't stop. It changed. The dragging sound was gone, and instead, I heard soft tapping. Like someone was lightly knocking on the wall, but the sound was irregular, coming from different parts of the room. It was unnerving because it didn't make sense. Who would be knocking on the wall at this time of night? I tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, another knock would sound, louder, closer. I sat up in bed, wide awake now, listening carefully. The noise was definitely coming from the adjoining room. I assumed someone was staying there, but it sounded like they were pacing, maybe knocking into the walls or something. It was just after midnight when I decided to call the front desk. The knocking had turned into something else, like scratching. It sounded like someone was dragging their nails down the wall, slow and deliberate. It made my skin crawl. I picked up the phone and called the front desk, asking if they could check the room next door. The guy at the desk was polite, but he sounded confused. He told me that the room next to mine, 215, was unoccupied. That didn't make sense. I heard the noises clear as day. I told him what I was hearing, and he promised to send someone up to check it out. I hung up, feeling uneasy. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps outside my door. I assumed it was hotel staff coming to check on the noise. I stayed quiet, listening, but the noises in the adjoining room stopped. There was nothing for a long while, just silence. After what felt like forever, the footsteps outside my door faded away, and the hallway was quiet again. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the front desk was wrong, or maybe the walls were thin, and I was hearing noises from another room. I turned off the lights and got back into bed, determined to sleep. But then, the tapping started again. It was softer this time, almost like someone was lightly knocking on the wall right next to my bed. I froze, listening. The taps were coming from the exact spot where the adjoining door was, the one that connected my room to the supposedly empty room next door. I stared at the door, barely breathing. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, like whoever was on the other side was trying to get my attention. My heart was racing, and I was too scared to move. I kept staring at the door, expecting it to open, but it didn't. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk again. My hands were shaking as I explained what was happening. The guy on the phone was calm, told me he'd send someone up right away. I didn't hang up. I just sat there, clutching the phone, waiting for help to arrive. I heard the footsteps in the hall again. They were slow, like whoever was out there was taking their time. But as soon as I heard them, the knocking stopped. The silence was even worse than the noise. I didn't hear the hotel staff knock on the door or check the room next door. They just left. I waited, not sure what to do. The room felt colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was on the other side of that door, watching me, waiting. I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, clutching my phone, my eyes locked on the adjoining door. Around 3 a.m., the knocking started again, louder this time. It sounded angry, like someone was pounding on the wall with their fists. I jumped out of bed, panicking. I ran to the door and pressed my ear against it, trying to hear what was on the other side. But all I heard was the pounding. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and threw on my shoes, deciding I was getting out of there. I didn't care about the time or the fact that I had nowhere else to go. I just needed to leave. As I opened my door to the hallway, I heard one final, deafening bang on the adjoining door, like someone was slamming their body against it. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran out of the room, down the hall, and straight to the front desk. The guy at the desk looked surprised to see me. I told him everything about the noises, the knocking, the scratching. He didn't seem to know what to say. He kept apologizing, offering to move me to another room, but I refused. I told him I was checking out early. I drove to a different hotel that night, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't sleep until I was in a different bed, far away from that place. A few days later, I got curious. I looked up the hotel online, wondering if anyone else had experienced something like I did. There were no reviews about strange noises or unoccupied rooms, but there was one thing that stood out. The room next to mine, 215, had been closed off for years. Some kind of water damage or structural issue. But that didn't explain the sounds I heard or the fact that someone or something had been trying to get through that door. I had been feeling overwhelmed by everything work, the constant notifications on my phone, emails, social media. It was all too much. So, I decided to rent a small, off-the-grid cabin in the middle of nowhere. No internet, no cell signal, just me and the quiet. It sounded like the perfect escape. The rental website said it was secluded and ideal for those looking to disconnect, and that's exactly what I needed. I drove up there late in the afternoon, following a long, winding dirt road deep into the woods. The cabin was small, just one room with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a fireplace. There was a small porch out front, overlooking the trees. It felt peaceful, isolated. I unpacked a few things, lit a fire, and settled in for the night, feeling like I had finally escaped the noise of the world. As the sun set, the forest got dark fast. There were no streetlights, just the glow from my lantern and the faint flicker of the fire. I was reading a book, enjoying the quiet, when I first heard it. A rustling outside, like leaves being stepped on. I figured it was just an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. It's the woods, after all. I tried not to think too much of it. But the sound kept going. Not the random scurrying of an animal, but something more deliberate, like footsteps. I put my book down and listened, the hair on the back of my neck starting to stand up. I walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. Just shadows and trees. Then, movement. There was someone out there. Just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, I saw him. A man. He was standing perfectly still, watching the cabin. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the shape of him, just standing there. My heart started pounding in my chest. Why would someone be out here? I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. I quickly closed the curtains and backed away from the window. I felt trapped, like there was nowhere to go. It was just me and this stranger in the woods. I thought about calling for help, but then I remembered, no phone, no internet. I was completely cut off. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just some local guy, maybe a hunter who got lost. But why was he just standing there? Why hadn't he come up to the cabin or said anything? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The footsteps started again, closer this time. I could hear them circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the fireplace, gripping it tight in my hand. I didn't know what else to do. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a tapping on the window. It was soft at first, just a light tap, tap, tap. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to look, to see if he was still there, but I was too afraid. I stayed where I was, clutching the fire poker, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. I jumped, backing away from the door. He was trying to get inside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear him breathing now, just on the other side of the door, heavy and slow. I didn't know what to do. There was no one around to help me, no way to call for help. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it never did. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away from the door, back around the cabin. I heard him walking around outside again, pacing. Watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire with the poker in my hands, jumping at every little sound. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I kept thinking about that man, wondering if he was still out there, hiding in the trees, waiting for me to let my guard down. When the sun finally came up, I felt a little bit safer, though not much. I peeked out the window, but there was no sign of him. Just the trees, quiet and still. I quickly packed my things, not wanting to stay another minute in that cabin. I was about to leave when I saw them. Footprints. Muddy footprints leading from the woods right up to the cabin door. They circled the cabin, over and over again. My stomach turned. I hadn't imagined it. He had been there, walking around the cabin all night long. I threw my stuff into the car and got out of there as fast as I could. As I drove down the dirt road, my hands were shaking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me, watching me leave. I don't know who that man was, or why he was there, but I never want to find out. All I know is that I'm never going back to that cabin.